to this working session 2 of this Human Dimension Implementation meeting. My name is Omer Fischer. I'm the head of the Human Rights Department at ODIHR, and I'm pleased to moderate this working session. The topic of this session is freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and national human rights institutions, and the role of civil society in the protection of human rights. This is a topic that encompasses many issues. We can focus on the questions that are included in our annotated agenda. For example, how can the full enjoyment of the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association be more effectively facilitated by participating states, including by ensuring the right to an effective remedy and accountability for undue state interferences and good practices in this regard? How can participating states create an enabling environment for the independent monitoring of the enjoyment of the freedoms of peaceful assembly and association and facilitate the work of monitors? What can be done to foster effective cooperation and dialogue between civil society and participating states? What are the good practices in this regard? What are the main positive trends and challenges in the implementation of OSCE commitments and other international obligations on the protection of human rights defenders? What are good practices related to interactions and cooperation between state authorities and human rights defenders? And how can NHRIs engage effectively with civil society organizations and human rights defenders to promote and protect human rights? These are some of the questions we may be able to cover during this session, but of course it's not an exclusive list, and we could explore other issues related to the topics that we are discussing today at this working session, keeping in mind that we should remain on topic. In other words, we should be discussing freedom of assembly and association, NHRIs, national human rights institutions, and the role of civil society in the protection of human rights. As you know, as per standard practice, we have a speakers list at the back of this table, where participants have to sign up if they would like to take the floor. We have a limit of 50 participants that can speak during the session, and I think we have already approaching this limit. A number of you have already indicated your interest in speaking today, so please, if you would like to make a statement, indicate that to my colleagues at the back of this table. And in addition to statements, you may wish to consider whether you would like also to ask any questions to our distinguished introducers, which you could also pose when you're given the floor, and we will try to make enough time, maybe 5 minutes at the end of the session, to answer any questions that may come during the working session. A reminder that speakers can only take the floor in the capacity in which they're registered, and only entities registered on the speakers list can be represented. Another reminder, as always, that you're encouraged and you're expected to intervene in a meaningful, orderly, and respectful manner. And a kind reminder to submit your statements to the interpreters. If you have statements, they will not be distributed to participants without your consent, and preferably also to our document distribution colleagues, to ensure that the flow of documents reflect the discussion, and the statements should be provided to the documentation desk in front of the plenary hall. So these were just a few technical reminders and a few words of introduction on the topic of this working session. And now I would like to introduce our speakers, starting from our first speaker today, Mrs. Milena Costas-Trascazas. Milena Costas-Trascazas is a human rights law expert currently working as a consultant for the UN. Since May 2016, she has been a member of the ODIHR Panel of Experts on Freedom of Peaceful Assembly, and from 2013 to 2015, she worked as a research fellow at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, and she was the main researcher in a project dealing with social protests and the use of force by law enforcement officials. Before, she was a research fellow at the Universidad Jaume I of Castellón, and she was also a postdoctoral researcher at the Università degli Studi di Milano, and lectured in several other universities and worked as legal advisor for the Human Rights Division of the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation. Mrs. Trascasas holds a PhD in Public International Law from the University Complutense of Madrid. Mrs. Trascasas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And if I may, I will speak in Spanish. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation to take part in this meeting. I would like during this session to share with you some thoughts about the essence of the freedom to peaceful assembly and association and how they contribute to consolidating and strengthening democracy. In particular, at this time when our societies face all sorts of political challenges, as well as social and economic challenges, these freedoms are more necessary than ever before, and that's going to be my main line of argument. It is more essential than ever before that governments and citizens form a joint front in order to preserve these rights and their implementation. The protection of these rights is essential to make sure that democratic values are not eroded and in order to preserve the rule of law. Building a representative democracy is an ongoing process, and nothing can be taken for granted. We need positive and decisive steps from governments in order to ensure progress to social justice. And in this process, the freedom to peaceful assembly and association take on their full meaning because they provide the basis on which we can work towards this goal peacefully and inclusively. I'd like to refer to the words of the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations on the right to peaceful assembly and association. The rapporteur said that when societies are deprived of the various forms and spaces for associating and mobilizing themselves, well, the opinions and preferences of the privileged social strata and of those who have access to power become the dominant views. Civil society serves not only to hold authorities to account, it also serves to complement government action, and it provides citizens with a space in which they can manage public affairs and the problems that affect them. The development of a robust and active civil society serves to reduce this gap, this disconnection between citizens on the one hand and the authorities and decision-making processes on the other. It also helps to channel frustration and social discontent, as well as the violent impulses that we've been seeing these days. And thanks to social participation, when it is constructive, communities become more resilient and countries become more stable. Throughout history, social mobilization has played a key role in many of the countries. We're all aware of that. It has played a key role in terms of driving human rights forward and also in terms of achieving social change and social achievements. I'd like to refer to one of Spain's experiences, which can be held up as an example, and this is the platform of the people affected by mortgages. This was a platform that was created in 2008 to support the victims of the economic crisis, and more specifically to help those people who were evicted due to the fact that they were unable to pay their mortgages, the mortgages which they had taken on with banks under abusive clauses. Anyway, this platform carried out a whole range of actions in order to help the evicted people. And the platform's members would meet in the houses when the families were about to be evicted, and they would support them, and they would request the security forces to not carry out the eviction orders. They would also go to the homes and the workplaces of the relevant political representatives who could play a role in changing the situation in order to draw attention to the desperation, the despair and the desperate situation in which the victims were. So these were the so-called crashes, and in 2013, thanks to a lot of support from the public in general, and also thanks to a decision that was taken by the EU Court of Justice, in 2014, the government actually was compelled to change national legislation thanks to the pressure that was brought to bear in order to protect the rights of debtors in such situations. And, of course, the ruling by the European Court stated that these evictions were based on abusive and unfair mortgage contracts. There is no doubt that in the sphere of the OSCE, there's a clear trend at the moment towards curtailing the freedoms of peaceful assembly and association. And I can give you some signs of this worrying trend. In the United States, since November 2016, more than 10 legislative initiatives have been adopted, all affecting the freedom to demonstrate, and 18 of them are still pending. In Spain, in 2016, there was a total of 34,000 fines that were imposed in relation to the exercise of the freedom of assembly, of information, and of expression. Out of these 34,000 fines, 19,500 were imposed following an administrative procedure, because the authorities' orders were disregarded. In France, there is a prohibition in place which prohibits any form of political meeting in which more than one person participates, due to the successive renovation of the fact that the state of emergency has been reimposed several times since the terrorist attack in November 2015. When there were the G20 and G7 summits, there was a huge political movement which was aimed at slowing down the anti-globalization movements. Furthermore, there are also multiple cases where we can see that private companies have covertly been carrying out surveillance of the Occupy movement and Greenpeace movements by gathering information about peaceful demonstrators. And in the United Kingdom, the intelligence services are managing a database with information about demonstrators who are considered to be domestic extremists. In some OSCE countries, a number of private companies have developed a strategy against public participation. This is known as SLAP, or SLPP. And the idea here is to intimidate NGOs, and particularly the smaller ones, as well as their members. The members, or the NGOs, are usually denounced, reported in such a way as that they are intimidated and discredited, and there are financial difficulties that are imposed upon them. There are other measures in terms of the fight against terrorism that are also problematic here from the point of view of human rights and the right to association. Increasing restrictions are being imposed on civil society organizations, and there are also additional barriers introduced by national legislations, national law, which affects primarily small NGOs. In Russia, around 100 NGOs have been included in the list of presumed foreign agents, and out of them, at least 27 have closed. And I'm sure my colleague will tell you more about this shortly. In many countries, there is an ongoing trend which consists of mixing social activism with extremism, or compounding the two, and the anti-terrorist laws are often used and abused in order to silence political dissent and criticism. In some cases, social organizations and their representatives are discredited by public officials and by the media, and they are accused of threatening national security or the country's stability, or of being the tools of foreign governments. The right to privacy has been violated when we're talking about activists, and very often police forces are given enhanced surveillance powers, and they can gather information through private internet companies and social network without there being an appropriate legal framework governing this. This morning we'll be talking about some of the measures which could help us inverse the trend and try to find a remedy to these worrying developments. The United Nations Human Rights Council asked the new United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to the freedom of assembly what states could do in order to improve the implementation of international standards. The rapporteur, rather spontaneously, replied that, well, we could implement the recommendations and prevent any violations of the rights. We member states have sufficient instruments, and we also have sufficient oversight bodies. In addition to the excellent work carried out by the Special Rapporteur on the freedom of association and assembly of the United Nations, we also have, within the OSCE region, multiple tools. There are the guidelines on the right to the freedom of assembly, which is a reference document for all of us. Then we have the panel of experts. There's ODIHR, there's the Venice Commission. These all provide direct support to member states with a view to helping them adapt their legislation and practices to international standards. The reports which are carried out following observation missions also provide member states with a whole series of very useful and practical recommendations. So we need to ask ourselves, why are we in such a worrying situation? It is indeed worrying that the space where these freedoms can be exercised is shrinking in some parts of the OSCE. Respecting these rights is essential for the respect of other rights, and not least the right to the freedom of expression. It is also essential to promote these rights in order to move further towards social justice in a peaceful and inclusive manner. We need to protect them and promote them very dynamically. To conclude, I would like to say that we need a change of mindset, a change of paradigm, and that we are at a turning point. I'd like to quote the former Special Rapporteur of the United Nations, Maina Kayai, and I would strongly recommend you read his reports, but I would like to quote some of the words that he pronounced during his resignation speech. He said, "We are currently in the midst of an epic global struggle. We cannot talk about this conflict with euphemisms such as a closed civil space or a reduced civil space. There's more at stake here. This is a fight for our future and for the future of democracy and for the future of democratic values." So as you can see, he was very blunt about it, and I will leave it at that, and I am available to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Trascasas, for this introduction, highlighting the importance of the freedoms of assembly and association as freedoms that enable participation and may also reduce violence in societies, and highlighting some of the challenges in the respect of these two freedoms. I will now give the floor to Mrs. Danuta Pshivara, our second introducer for this working session. Danuta Pshivara has been a co-founder of the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights since 1989 and chair of the board of the Helsinki Foundation for Fundamental Rights since 2008. Before that, Mrs. Pshivara was employed at the Institute of Psychology of the Polish Academy of Sciences, and in the 80s she was a mediator with the Mazovsha Region Mediation Committee of the Solidarity Trade Union. Since 1982, she has been a member of the Helsinki Committee in Poland and the co-author of several of its reports. Mrs. Pshivara, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'll be speaking in Russian. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, freedom of association and freedom of peaceful assembly are two fundamental principles and values for a good foundation for democracy. Now, I'll start out with the fact that despite the new approaches that have been adopted in recent years, and in particular the principles adopted by the OSCE on the defense of human rights defenders, this is still not being enforced and applied by an entire group of participating states. And the number of participating states where these principles are not respected is increasing. And so there is a shrinking space for the work of a civil society, and that is a global phenomenon. But Central and Eastern Europe and the post-Soviet states currently find themselves in the group where these values are suffering most. And this is due first and foremost to a new authoritarianism in the Russian Federation and a growing imperialism in the policies of the Russian Federation, which is resulting in more and more authoritarianism in other former Soviet states. But that has now spread also to Turkey and the countries of Central Europe. And it would seem that given the systems prevailing in these countries, one would have expected them to be well protected from such trends. But I'm referring here first and foremost to Hungary and Poland, where there are on paper guarantees of constitutional rule of law, but that is being now overturned with attacks on free media, on independent judiciaries, and on the activities of NGOs. And these actions have the objective of limiting or even eliminating civil society. And this is something that has already been referred to by the previous introducer. But this is based on campaigns that slander well-established NGOs. This includes discreditation of civil society organizations and individuals in the eyes of the society, dividing NGOs into the good ones and the bad ones, the right ones and the propagandist ones funded from abroad. And there are more and more supporters of these trends. There are constant verifications of individuals. There are different ways, of course, of using the apparatus of the administration to intimidate NGOs through taxation, refusal to renew leases, and this has also become forceful environment in many cases, limiting access to grants provided by the state or by foreign funders as well. And a particularly complex and dangerous situation is the situation of human rights defenders. Ordinarily, they control the state and make sure that the state is, in fact, implementing its international obligations, but often they are the first target through media campaigns that seek to discredit them, to remove their authority, and there is also an attack on the Ombudsman, the official defenders of human rights, especially when they seek independently to protect the civil and political rights of individuals. And on the other hand, the limitations imposed on organizations of peaceful assemblies in various ways through limiting the geography available to them, the time available to them, the number of various conditions that have to be met for a peaceful assembly to be organized, imposing sanctions, fines, when certain conditions are not met, dividing peaceful assemblies into better and worse ones, and all of this has a limiting effect for the expression of the right to peaceful assembly. Now, one can draw the conclusion that the authorities are seeking to create a situation in which they will never lose power. And the civil society and ordinary citizens whose rights are being removed will no longer need those rights because the new powers will be in place forever. Now, in a globalized world with more and more exchange of information and ideas, and with the constant creation of new social spaces, and in the context of societies that have tasted freedom, this kind of conviction is, I believe, rather strange, even an aberration, would I say, ladies and gentlemen. So I think the high time has come to ask whether the states participating in the Helsinki process really want to make every possible effort to make sure that the values set out in international documents really will be implemented, or is it just a question of a manipulating game in which those processes or those institutions in place that could allow for peaceful resolution of disputes between citizens and authorities will be brought to naught. Now, if we really want to have effective instruments to defend human rights defenders, I would suggest that we start by making sure that OSCE participating states really implement the recommendations that were adopted in Hamburg in December of 2016 during the parallel conference there of NGOs. The essence of those recommendations is that there should be a group of experts on the defense of human rights defenders, and ODIHR should monitor the process of implementation of these fundamental principles by states, and do this in close consultation with civil society, taking advantage of information received from NGOs. There should be more systematic work with other non-governmental organizations to make sure that the space available to civil society for its independent work, independent of the authorities, is increased rather than reduced. The criteria should be based also on the recommendations of the UN Committee on Human Rights and also the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. These various recommendations and a number of facts that fully confirm the need for such principles are set out I think, in the text that was provided to you yesterday. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Shiva, for another interesting presentation in which you highlighted some of the challenges civil society organizations face in playing their role and doing their work. And also thank you for recommendations, including to us, coming from the Hamburg Civil Society Parallel Conference, which we are aware of and we will continue to consider very carefully. We are now moving on to the next part of the working session, when I will open the floor to the audience for your statements from the floor. The number we have already, as I understand, almost reached the number of 50 speakers. We are at 47, so there are still 3 slots available. And as I said, we have a limit of 50 participants that can speak during the working session. The speaking time for each intervention is 2 minutes and 30 seconds. We will try to stick to that, and I'm kindly asking you to keep your statements brief and to the point, preferably listing first your recommendations. And as I mentioned already, if there are any questions for our introducers, we will do our best to leave enough time, maybe 5 minutes at the end of the working session, to give them the opportunity to answer these questions. Before speaking, kindly introduce yourself, name an organization or delegation or institution that you represent. As always, criticism is welcome, but should be constructive. With this, I'm now opening the floor to interventions. And the first speaker on my list is the United Kingdom on behalf of the EU, which will then be followed by Switzerland. United Kingdom on behalf of the EU, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm honoured to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, as well as Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia and Montenegro. We are delighted that this topic remains front and centre of the HDIM agenda this year. We are deeply concerned by continued new restrictions on civil society actors, increasing restrictions on peaceful assembly, and attacks on and detention of human rights defenders in parts of the OSCE region. We strongly believe that civil society is an essential part of any functioning society and welcome the many civil society organisations that are here today. We will continue to challenge those states which are increasingly using legislative and regulatory approaches to civil society, which contribute to the pattern of shrinking civil society space. Laws which restrict access to finance, which label NGOs as foreign agents or undesirable organisations, run counter to international standards and OSCE commitments. They have a chilling effect on civil society and in extreme cases lead to criminalisation of legitimate civil society work. We call on those states to align their policies and legislation with OSCE human dimension commitments. The right to peaceful assembly is an essential part of progressive functioning society. This is not an absolute right and can be subject to restriction, but restriction must be the exception, not the rule, and must be necessary and proportionate. We are therefore concerned by instances when this right has been curtailed, including when states have refused permission for peaceful assembly without due cause, have preemptively detained organisers, monitors and journalists, and have also detained large numbers of peaceful protesters exercising this fundamental human right. We call on all states to uphold their commitments and encourage greater engagement with ODIHR, including in work to monitor peaceful assembly. Support to human rights defenders is one of the EU's human rights priorities. States should recognise the specific risks that human rights defenders face and refrain from any act that violates those rights. Human rights defenders are not defined by who they are, but what they do and the principles they stand for, including protecting the rights of others. This includes, but is not limited to, those working on gender equality, the rights of LGBTI people, persons belonging to national minorities, religious minorities and majorities, and the rights of persons with disabilities, as well as those working generally on civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights. We're therefore deeply concerned by the arbitrary detention of individuals who work to defend human rights, including civil society actors, journalists, politicians, academics, lawyers and others. We call on all states to ensure no one is targeted because of their work to defend human rights. States should respect that dissenting views expressed peacefully and publicly are part of a functioning democracy. In closing, we would like to pay tribute to the work of human rights defenders and civil society organisations, including those whose cases we have raised in the OSCE Permanent Council in Vienna this year, including civil society organisations such as Memorial International Society, the Sova Centre, Open Russia, the Open Russia Civic Movement, the Institute of Modern Russia, Vyasna Belarus, the Administrative Centre of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia, Grigory Shvedov, Saparnamed Niskoliev, Mehmed Husseinov, Afghan Mukhtarli, and Yelena Milashina, Max Bakayev, Talgat Ayan, Ildar Dadin, and Valentina Cherevatenko, Tanya Kilic, Edel Essa, Ilkorn Osten, Gunnar Korsen, Vele Aju, Nalan Erkam, Oslem Dalkiran, Nejat Tastam, Sejmus Osbekeli, Peter Stoitner, Ali Garavi in Turkey. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. A fuller written version of this statement will be circulated after the meeting with a full list of aligning states.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Switzerland, followed by the US. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Moderator. Switzerland would like to make two recommendations. First of all, we invite member states to make use of the ODIHR guidelines on the freedom to assembly and the protection of human rights activists. Switzerland also invites member states to implement the report on the good management of gatherings approved by the United Nations in March 2016. We also call on the relevant bodies to support increased civil society participation and human rights activist participation in multilateral fora, including within the OSCE, and to abstain from any reprisals against them. Moderator, increased violations of the right to peaceful assembly and association and the ever greater shrinking civil society space, including in OSCE states, reminds us of how important our discussions today are. The fact that public gatherings are prohibited, that access to internet is limited, that human rights activists are harassed, as are journalists, the fact that there are obstacles to NGOs registering or difficulties for them to obtain financing, all of this runs counsel to the OSCE's principles. The fact that these repressive practices are becoming systemic in some member states of the OSCE area is also a worrying indicator of the fact that some member states are sliding from democracy towards what we could call pseudo-democracy, which is a form of curtailing freedoms and which takes on the external trappings of democracy, but which has lost the essence of it and the main attributes of democracy, which of course are designed to protect freedoms and individual rights. What can we do to counter this trend? One thing would be to commit fully to the protection and promotion of human rights in the context of peaceful demonstrations. That is Switzerland's approach. Therefore, Switzerland has placed this item on the agenda since 2010 of the United Nations Human Rights Council, and we have supported the development of a joint report that was published in 2016 and which contains a compilation of practical recommendations on the proper handling of peaceful demonstrations. I will leave it at that because my time is up and I would like to stick to time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, the United States of America, which will be followed by the Commonwealth of Independent States Elections Monitoring Organization. United States of America, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The freedoms to associate and assemble peacefully are essential for a stable, open, and dynamic society and to a democratic and responsive governance. We share the concern expressed by our Spanish panelist that the space for civil society is shrinking, particularly for those who are on the front lines, the defenders of human rights. The question that our Polish guest asked, do we as participating states want to implement the principles we agreed on? I think most of us in this room, whether we're representing a participating state or the important member of civil society, would take a look at the region and regrettably say no, based on practice, regrettably. We commend Ukraine for providing security to LGBTI equality marches, but are concerned about reports of detentions and abuse against peaceful participants in pride events in Turkey. In Russia-occupied Crimea, yesterday's 8-year sentencing of Akhtem Chigos is the latest politically motivated action against the leadership of the Crimean Tatar Mejlis, punishing the community for its opposition to Russia's attempted annexation. The United States rejects Russia's illegitimate occupation and purported annexation of Crimea, which remains part of Ukraine. Kazakhstan has used charges of incitement to social discord to restrict peaceful demonstrations. We call for the release of Max Bokayev and Talgat Ayan, imprisoned for participating in peaceful protests against the land code reform. The United States is concerned about repression of civil society in Tajikistan. NGOs there face increasing scrutiny that creates a climate of self-censorship, and the local authorities there have retaliated against relatives of opposition activists abroad. In Belarus, despite finally registering Tell the Truth, the government refuses to register other human rights and political organizations. More than 1,000 protesters were detained and over a dozen arbitrarily held for over 2 months following protests. The government denies permits for demonstrations in an attempt to silence opposition voices. The United States urges Azerbaijan to cease its harassment of opposition figures and the firing of those who support opposition parties. We call for the release of those incarcerated for exercising freedoms of association and peaceful assembly. We also urge Azerbaijan to amend restrictive NGO legislation, unfreeze bank accounts of NGOs and their leaders, and return confiscated equipment. We remain deeply concerned by Turkey's continued detention of Amnesty International's Taner Kilic and İdil Eser. The United States condemns the detention of peaceful protests in Russia. Over 17,000 people were arrested on June 12 alone, some simply for reading the Russian Constitution in public. Alexander Navalny has been the target of repression for his role in organizing public demonstrations. This pattern of abuse deprives Russian citizens of the essential conditions for free and fair elections. We remain concerned by restrictive laws on foreign agents and undesirable foreign organizations. The anti-extremism monitoring organization Sova Center and its director were charged last week with alleged violations of the undesirable organizations law. Finally, Hungary has adopted a law that will weaken the ability to organize and address concerns. The bill stigmatizes civil society organizations working to combat corruption and promote good governance. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Commonwealth of the Independent States Elections Monitoring Organization, which will be followed by the Russian Federation. Commonwealth of Independent States Election Monitoring Organization, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Alexei Semenov. I'm a political scientist, and I want to raise the issue of problems of national human rights institutions. My report is dedicated to the Ombudsman institution in Ukraine and attacks on the independence of the Constitutional Court. In July, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko signed the law on the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. This law has drawn a lot of criticism from lawyers, anti-corruption organizations, and human rights groups. Firstly, the new law gives the president more powers to control the judiciary. Now, instead of the parliament speaker, the president does personally sign and hand over certificates to the judges. This means that the president now has the opportunity to abuse the admission of judges to their duties. These actions of the Ukrainian authorities undermine the independence of the country's highest court. There is a serious danger that judges will get under the control of the president. In fact, the executive authorities in Ukraine are trying to seize the Constitutional Court. And secondly, the procedure for electing the Ombudsman, a person authorized by the Parliament to protect human rights, has been changed. Earlier, the Ombudsman was elected by secret ballot. The new law provides for an open voting. It is obvious that the members of Parliament may vote under pressure. As a result, the post of the Ombudsman may be occupied by a political appointee who will act in the interests of his party. The Ombudsman institution is a mechanism of parliamentary control of utmost importance, which should be independent. The Ombudsman is a key post in those states that are striving to be democratic. Throughout the world, the Ombudsman is being secretly chosen among the competent lawyers and human rights activists. The new law is an obvious attempt of certain political forces to politicize the position of the Ombudsman in favor of party interests. It casts doubt on the independence of the newly elected Ombudsman and limits the functioning of one of the most important institutions of the modern rule of law state. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Russian Federation, which will be followed by the Turkmenistan Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights. Russian Federation, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, the Russian Federation considers the right to freedom of association and assembly and the complementary right to freedom of expression as extremely important aspects of a democratic society. Unfortunately, in some states of the OSCE, the unlimited right to freedom of assembly and association takes the form of blind political correctness. And the most extreme example of this are the events in the American city of Charlottesville, in connection with which the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has applied its early warning measures and urgent procedures. And I think that the executive structures of the OSCE should pay more attention to the fact that there is indulgent treatment of neo-Nazi events. This cannot be. This is justified by freedom of expression, some sort of historic injustice, or an interest in history and other approaches to the National Socialist movement in Germany. And it's symptomatic that this was referred to by a highly placed Ukrainian official when he approved the organization of demonstrations by the Azov regiment. As you know, every year in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, there are neo-Nazi events and movements. In Latvia, there's a youth movement of neo-Nazis. In Estonia, every year there are meetings of the Waffen-SS legionnaires. And it is worth noting that at the present time it is Estonia that holds the presidency of the EU Council. In Germany, according to official statistics in 2016, there were 310 neo-Nazi processions in which 30,000 people participated. And we see this occurring in a number of countries where the right to freedom of association is treated with so much political correctness that it becomes absurd. For instance, in Norway on 29 July in Kristiansand, there was an unpunished march of European extreme rightists. The police controlled the situation from a distance. Symbols of the 30 January SS regiment were used, and measures were applied only to those who protest against this march. Ukraine was the only one of 50 states in the world where on the 9th of May, the day of victory, peaceful demonstrators who wanted to honor the memory of Soviet soldiers who had freed the country from Nazism were sanctioned. That happened only there and in none of the other 50 countries. So one cannot go beyond that principle that the human rights of one ends when the human rights of someone else has started. So I think that this is a clear message, but we will set out this in greater detail in our written text, which will be available on the ODIHR site.
Rights, which will be followed by the International Humanist and Ethic Union. Turkmenistan Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. Although the official Turkmen delegation has once again ignored this meeting, we have a number of questions for the Turkmenistan authorities. Why are they not making it easier for NGOs to register? Are NGOs needed to register, are forced to register in Bulgaria, even though we would be happy to register in Turkmenistan if we could? Unfortunately, Turkmenistan seems to fear dissent. There is also the issue concerning the trade unions, and in Turkmenistan, rights and freedoms are violated instead of being promoted. The authorities seem to understand as they see fit what freedom of assembly is, and they regularly use hundreds of thousands of people for various government-organized rallies. And they go to concerts, they are used for opening roads, for inaugurating meetings, and on the other hand, a number of basic fundamental rights are violated, and hundreds of minors are used at any time of day and night and left hungry. They are kept out of touch from their parents, and in kindergartens, they're what we call peaceful assemblies, where a personality cult is installed, a personality cult for the leaders, and yet the rights of the people concerned are not protected. The rights of these children are not protected. So what can be done to address this? Why does nobody prevent local mayors from using children as slaves? Sanctions are imposed against Russia, and yet Turkmenistan, a very authoritarian country, seems to remain above criticism and sanctions. Why? The Turkmenistan's authorities continue to pander to European officials, and I will have to leave it at that due to time. The full text will be made available. Thank you.
Very much. The next speaker is the International Humanist and Ethic Union, followed by Kyrgyzstan. International Humanist and Ethic Union, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The OSCE guidelines on freedom of peaceful assembly prohibit any discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation. This inclusion is important since, as recognized by the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, LGBTI people are some of the most vulnerable in terms of having their rights to free association and peaceful assembly denied. Currently, Russia and potentially Kyrgyzstan, through draft laws, violates these basic rights through laws that criminalize public assembly and association of LGBTI groups and restrict the work of organizations defending LGBTI people and their rights. Moreover, as observed by the experts at the outset, such laws have been accompanied by bans and proposed bans on non-governmental organizations receiving funding from abroad. The 2013 Russian law banning the distribution of material on LGBTI rights is officially for the purpose of protecting children from information advocating for the denial of traditional family values. The underlying assumptions upon which this purpose relies are morally obnoxious and benighted and amount to state-sponsored hate speech against a minority group. Indeed, anti-LGBTI initiatives like homosexual propaganda laws and bans on LGBTI peaceful assembly suggest that homophobia is officially sanctioned and inevitably inculcates a climate of impunity and hate, further inhibiting the freedom of assembly and association of LGBTI people. Vigilante acts, including outing, hunting, torture, and even murder of known suspected LGBTI people and activists, has been reported in Russia. And in Chechnya, state instruments have been implicated in violence. In Kyrgyzstan, whilst homophobia is not a new phenomenon, local activists have observed that the draft law has created a permissive climate in which vigilante groups feel justified to take the law into their own hands. While some OSCE participating states may argue that there are no specific commitments on this issue, the Copenhagen document, Ministerial Decision number 909 on combating hate crimes and international human rights standards make plain the grave violations against the realization of freedom of peaceful assembly such laws encapsulate. In some states have an unequivocal obligation to protect right to freedom of association and peaceful assembly without discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity. To that end, we call on Russia to repeal its discriminatory provisions and urge Kazakhstan to halt the process of introducing its gay propaganda and foreign agent laws. We call on both states to protect LGBTI persons seeking to associate and assemble from attacks and reprisals through preventative measures and by investigating attacks, prosecuting perpetrators and ensuring remedy for victims. Finally, we call for a full investigation of all facts about unlawful repression of Chechnya of LGBTI population, punishment for the guilty parties, and an end to the practice of extrajudicial violence and killings in the Republic. Thank you. Apologies for going over time.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Kyrgyzstan, which will be followed by Finland. Kyrgyzstan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, dear participants. The freedom of association is a fundamental right, human right, which is associated, of course, with the right to freedom of expression. It's set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant. Now, the Kyrgyz Republic supports these founding principles and has implemented them in its national legislation. The main principles of protecting freedom of assembly are set out in the constitution of the country, and there are laws adopted that implement all of this. And if there is no notification, if it isn't done on time, if there are other violations of the conditions, that doesn't nevertheless result in a prohibition. Now, our country has adopted in its parliament in 2012 a law on peaceful assembly, and this is something that guarantees the right of citizens to organize such assemblies. And when we drafted this law, we took into consideration the opinions of human rights defenders, of professional legal professionals, and the OSCE, and also the Venice Commission. Now, this guarantees the possibility for each citizen of our country to transmit information under the right to freedom of expression in the public space. Now, human rights, of course, end where the human rights of another person start. And in connection with this, legislation does set out certain limitations on the holding of peaceful assemblies. Public law and order has to be ensured, national security, but such limitations must be based on a judicial decision. The right to freedom of association is also regulated by our various legal acts. Now, the legislation of the country provides also for the organization of associations without registration, and one can do this on the basis of appeal to the right of peaceful assembly. Now, at the present time in the country, we have registered a very large number of non-governmental groupings. Let me mention some of them: 228 political parties, 5,486 civil society foundations, 831 commercial cooperatives. And maybe I can just take a few seconds to talk about our human rights defense institutions. We have two of them. One is a classical ombudsman, and in 2012 the Parliament decided to set up a national center for the prevention of torture and other inhuman forms of treatment and punishment. So I know my time has ended, so the full text will be distributed after the meeting. Thank you.
The next speaker is Finland, followed by the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. Finland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Finland fully aligns itself with the EU statement and recommendations presented by the United Kingdom. The promotion and protection of human rights is a high priority for Finland. Freedom of association and assembly are key to a democratic society and functioning of active and free civil society. It is fair to say that a vibrant and pluralistic civil society has benefited my country tremendously by increasing stability, equality, and prosperity. Thanks to the internet and social media, human rights are better known worldwide than ever before. However, in many countries around the world, the space of civil society has shrunk. There are new threats to freedom of association and expression, for example, growing attempts to use technical means to censor information and ideas online. Promotion of the work of human rights defenders is a traditional priority for Finland. We are very concerned about the increasing attempts to limit and prevent the work of human rights defenders in many countries. NGOs, journalists, bloggers, and others promote human rights or reveal human rights violations and corruption. Human rights defenders must be able to work safely without fear and harassment. Our government is a strong supporter of the work of the OSCE in the field of human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. We support the OSCE independent institutions and their strong and independent mandates, and highly appreciate their vital work, including the promotion of the issues we are discussing today: freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association. We would like to present the following recommendations. All of us, we, the participating states, should guarantee a free and active participation of civil society and free civil society space, as well as promote cooperation with civil society. Guarantee an enabling environment for the work of human rights defenders so that they can work safely and without fear and harassment, with particular attention to women human rights defenders. Support and promote the implementation of the guidelines on the protection of the human rights defenders published by ODIHR, as well as guiding documents on freedom of peaceful assembly. Support the work of the OSCE independent institutions and their strong and independent mandates. This statement will be distributed in full version in a written form. I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, which will be followed by Wiener Akademikerbund. Hungarian Helsinki Committee, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is David Vig, and I'm from the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. I wish to draw your attention to the alarmingly shrinking space for civil society and the growing obstacles faced by the human rights defenders in Hungary. This summer, the law on transparency of organizations receiving foreign funds, the so-called anti-NGO law, was adopted. Under the anti-NGO law, any civil society organizations that receives over around $28,000 annually from foreign sources should register as an organization receiving foreign funds in a state register and should display this stigmatizing label on all of its publications. This label was invented in the political discourse to stigmatize independent CSOs. The law is a part of a series of measures that began in 2013, designed to discredit and silence civil society organizations that are trying to hold the government to account to its obligations concerning anti-corruption, environment protection, fundamental rights, democracy and the rule of law, commitments that are central to human dimension. To date, 233 Hungarian NGOs have publicly condemned the anti-NGO law, as we believe it is unnecessary, stigmatizing and harmful. Unnecessary because Hungarian civil society organizations are already transparent in their operations. Stigmatizing because the law implies that organizations which work for the benefit of Hungarian society by receiving international grants for their work pose a threat to the country. And harmful because it is undermining mutual trust in society and questions the right to freedom of expression. We recommend and call on the OSCE and OSCE participating states to continue monitoring the situation of human rights defenders and independent civil society organizations in Hungary and intensify efforts to empower and support them, including through political, legal and financial assistance. Urge the government of Hungary to fully implement the OSCE guidelines on the protection of human rights defenders. Most notably, the government should be urged to refrain from using accusatory and labeling rhetorics against human rights defenders and independent CSOs. Instead, it should be encouraged to take proactive steps to counter discrediting of human rights defenders and independent civil society organizations by political leaders and in the media. We recommend to engage with the government of Hungary to encourage meaningful dialogue between the government and civil society in order to ensure that institution building, development and other programs are human rights compliant. We recommend to explore and strengthen non-governmental alternative sources and means of funding for independent civil society. And we also recommend to monitor the impact of the legislation as well as other measures and related actions, including communications by state actors and the media targeting the funding and operations of civil society organizations in Hungary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And the next speaker is the Wiener Akademikerbund, which will be followed by the International Public Fund, Russian Peace Foundation. Wiener Akademikerbund, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Henrik Clausen, representing Wiener Akademikerbund. I'm very pleased to be here in Poland, the first country to defeat communism. I recently visited the Solidarność Museum in Gdansk and was touched by seeing how many ordinary DC citizens participated in the resistance. Even today, freedom of assembly is alive and well here, where citizens routinely assemble for a wide variety of topics. Unfortunately, this is no longer so west of Vienna for several reasons. I'll be specific about one of these threats, a left-wing extremist group called Antifa, short for anti-fascists. West of Vienna, the authorities have been unable or unwilling to counter this challenge properly, in contrast to effective police action east of Vienna. Antifa is a loosely connected movement that pretends to target so-called fascists or national socialists. In reality, they attack attack constitution-friendly and pro-democracy activists worried about the future of our secular societies, equal rights of women, and the introduction of Sharia law into our societies. Antifa maliciously misuses the OSCE guidelines clause for counter-demonstrations to be visible in order to provoke fights and violence. This used to be mainly a European problem, attacking events about non-Muslim minorities, for freedom demonstrations in Denmark, dancing events in Vienna, imagine that, and similar traditional expressions of free societies. But recently, Antifa has been more active in America, in particular in Charlottesville, where they showed their destructive power. Police inaction is a major part of the problem here. When police proactively protects properly registered peaceful assemblies, the attack ceases and freedom is restored. When police neglects the duty to protect freedom of peaceful assembly, this freedom withers. This must not happen. We therefore recommend that OSCE participating states protect freedom, peaceful assemblies much more proactively, that authorities clearly identify the primary sources of violence, that extremist groups such as Antifa be investigated and dissolved under the law, and that the OSCE guidelines be amended to remove the right of counter-demonstrators to be close to the demonstration they oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the International Public Fund Russian Peace Foundation, which will be followed by Canada. Russian Peace Foundation, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Anatoly Solsky from the Russia Peace Foundation. Internet and the freedom of association and assembly interact, and internet has changed the situation. The world is now very cosmopolitan, and restrictions to citizens' activities can cause a storm on internet, and that can be problematic for states. So some states try to regulate internet. That is actually a global trend, which is very telling. But the question is very tricky because on internet there are, in addition to human rights activists, a number of destructive and nefarious groups, including terrorist groups. It is important, therefore, on an intergovernmental basis to develop a set of rules which will shield human rights activism from other more nefarious groups and prevent them from being confused. We really need very important rules today, and in particular, given yesterday's discussions, we know that human rights activism is under threat. And given interstate conflicts today, there is a high degree of politicization. And there is an old declaration which is often violated, and the OSCE has developed a sort of Bureau of Illusions, we feel, and the regulation of internet can be used to help human rights organizations if it is done properly. We need, for instance, to focus on issues that are of importance to all states. The OSCE needs new forms of action in accordance with modern realities, and the OSCE is indeed at a crossroads here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Canada, which will be followed by the Election Monitoring and Democracy Studies Center. Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. As recognized in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the right to form groups, to organize, and to assemble with the aim of addressing issues of common concern is a fundamental human right. This right is an essential pillar of a free and democratic society. In Canada, where the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms affords the highest level of legal protection to these and other human rights, public demonstrations are a recognized and accepted part of our democratic life. Individuals have the legal right to peacefully gather, associate, demonstrate, and protest as a means of exercising their fundamental right to freedom of expression. We believe strongly that these rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association strengthen our democracy, and that our prosperity relies upon a free and vibrant civil society. Canada recognizes the vital role played by human rights defenders and civil society advocates in protecting and promoting human rights and strengthening the rule of law. Human rights defenders and civil society advocates help to draw the attention of governments and communities to human rights challenges that need to be addressed. Their work is vital in urging governments to be more accountable, thus supporting better governance and government policy. In this regard, we deplore the threats and harassment that human rights defenders and civil society advocates face on an ongoing basis in many parts of the OSCE area, especially given their courage in denouncing human rights violations, corruption, and attacks against vulnerable populations and civil society itself. Moreover, we continue to be concerned by the restrictions on freedom of association and peaceful assembly that occurs within the OSCE area. Such restrictions have been increasingly pursued through prohibitory legal frameworks that curtail the registration, funding, and activities of human rights defenders and civil society organizations. We're also very concerned with rising trends of threats, including online, being directed at human rights defenders, which are often disproportionately directed at women human rights defenders. We are seeing more enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrests, unlawful imprisonment, torture, and unfair trials in the OSCE region. Mr. Moderator, we can and must combat this increasing threat to human rights defenders and civil society advocates in a concrete and systematic manner. To this end, Canada has recently released public guidelines for our officials on supporting human rights defenders of all types. These guidelines are meant to be a practical instrument to Canadian missions and officials abroad to help empower human rights defenders, enabling them to be more effective advocates. In this, we join the OSCE, the EU, and individual states such as the Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, and the UK in promulgating guidelines in the hopes of better achieving a meaningful impact. It is incumbent on all OSCE participating states, however, to counter all threats to human rights defenders and civil society. In conclusion, Mr. Moderator, it is crucial that OSCE participating states make a conscious effort to support the exercise of fundamental freedoms in their countries. In this regard, we would like to put forward the following 3 recommendations. Firstly, that OSCE participating states that have not yet done so develop and publicize guidelines for government officials to follow in order to support human rights defenders. Secondly, that participating states ensure that laws, regulations, and practices do not unduly restrict the composition and activities of civil societies. And finally, and very importantly, that participating states promote and enable an active and effective participation of civil society in multilateral forums such as today's Human Dimension Implementation meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Election Monitoring and Democracy Studies Center, which will be followed by the Union of Journalists of Russia. Election Monitoring and Democracy Studies Center, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like first to address my our organization recommendation. Our recommendation based on first and second question of the annotated agenda, and recommendation will be addressed to the state party concerned. First recommendation is that the state party concerned, I mean Azerbaijan, should adopt new concept of civil society. Which I will try to explain then. Secondly, the Azerbaijan should recognize non-registered association of legal personality. Thirdly, Azerbaijan should simplify registration procedure rules of NGOs. Then, Azerbaijan should allow reasonable funding of NGOs. And then unreasonable internal inspection by authorities should be dismissed, and the dissolution procedure of NGOs should become unnecessary interference, and then the joint criminal case by Office of Prosecutor General should be dismissed. This recommendation based on the following grounds. Firstly, Azerbaijan doesn't accept the unregistered NGOs as a legitimate parties of civil society. Therefore, the criminal case by Office of Prosecutor General initiated against non-registered NGOs on the basis of that they have not registration and they are unlawful parties. So it's a big problem for Azerbaijani, it's a base of Azerbaijani civil society's problem. This problem supported by data that there are so many registration cases before European Court of Human Rights. Our detailed explanation and data will be submitted to the documentation desk after this meeting.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Union of Journalists of Russia, which will be followed by the Western Trace Minority University Graduate Association. Union of Journalists of Russia, you have the floor.
Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, the freedom of association and assembly and the work of human rights defenders and the setting up of a civil society is not possible without the existence of civil society organizations of journalists. And we, the Union of Journalists of Russia, are one of the very largest in this regard. Now, since the international community and participating OSCE member states are very interested in Crimea, I'd like to explain what the Union is doing in Crimea. The situation in the Republic of Crimea, the activities of human rights defenders and civil society organizations on the territory are subject to a lot of myths and even lies. And this is based on hate speech against the supposed occupation annexation, that there is a threat for individual Crimeans. Now, the rule of law and humanism must be at the basis of any action of human rights defense organization, and one needs to look at whether human rights violations are widespread in nature and whether they are part and parcel of the policy. Now, we have 55,000 members working in thousands of different kinds of media outlets, television, radio, and the written press. And the freedom of assembly and association has never been limited by anyone. We hold dozens of such meetings every year. And since the setting up of the Union of Journalists of Crimea, we have received no single complaint from Crimean journalists. And we don't make any distinction between those who are members of the Union and those who are freelancers. We assist all of them when they need our assistance, unless they refuse to cooperate with us. Now, in the name of the Union of Journalists of Crimea, I would call upon you to familiarize yourselves with the text that we have made available in full. Thank you.
Minority University Graduate Association, which will be followed by the Center for Research and Protection of Fundamental Rights. Western Trace Minority University Graduate Association, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Distinguished delegates, my name is Onur Mustafa Ahmet, and representing Turkish minority of Western Thrace, we call upon the Greek state, 1. To respect and implement the 2008 decisions of European Court of Human Rights about the reopening of Anti-Turkish Union. 2. To respect and promote the establishment of the Cultural Association of the Turkish Women of the region of Rodopi and Evros Minority Youth Association based on 2008 decision of the same court. 3. To repeal any restrictions on the right to freedom of association discriminating against Turkish minority. It's a fact that Greek state recognizes the mother tongue of the minority as Turkish and thus provides Turkish education in minority primary schools. Paradoxically, Greek state does not recognize our minority as Turkish, but as Muslim. Because of this basic identity issue, many human rights issues emerged through the years. Until the 80s, Greek state has been referring to us as Turkish minority, with the Turkish signs in minority schools and in NGOs. Since 80s, all the signs in minority schools have been changed to Muslim minority, and the legal NGOs that had Turkish word in terms of ethnic origin in their titles were banned by Greek authorities. Xanthi Turkish Union, founded in 1927, Komotini Turkish Union, founded in 28, Western Thrace Turkish Teachers Union, founded in 36. All these were closed down after 1983, although Greece had become EU member then. Besides these closings, Greek state also did not allow officially the establishment of any minority foundations which contained Turkish word in its title. In 2008, the court decided that Greece violated the right to freedom of assembly and association by closing Xanthi Turkish Union and not permitting the establishment of the other two associations. Despite these decisions in favor of our minority, Greek authorities insistently keep on repeating that they are working on new regulations in order to solve these issues. But it is clear that they have no intention to follow these decisions because, as Turkish minority, unfortunately, we are considered as a threat to its national security. On the one hand, Greek state emphasizes that the minority is Muslim, that contains Turkish Pomak and Roma people. On the other hand, it permits officially the establishment of foundations that contain in their titles Pomak and Roma words, but unfortunately not the ones with the Turkish word. It's obvious that there is no freedom of assembly and association in Greece for the only recognized minority within its borders. Nevertheless, we believe that Greek state could get over this Turkish word obsession by just implementing the simple decisions of the court. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much. Before we move on to the next speaker, let me just inform you that the list of speakers is now closed. We have reached the maximum number of 50. And with this, let's move on to the next speaker. The next speaker is the Center for Research and Protection of Fundamental Rights, which will be followed by the Human Rights Movement of Crimea. Center for Research and Protection of Fundamental Rights, you have the floor. Is there a representative of the Center for Research and Protection of Fundamental Rights in the room? If not, then I suggest we move to the following speaker, the Human Rights Movement of Crimea, which will be followed by the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatars. Human Rights Movement of Crimea, you have the floor.
I am Enver Kadyrov from the Human Rights Movement of Crimea. I would like to talk about the problem concerning the protection of human rights defenders and civil society activists in annexed Crimea. I represent one of a handful of human rights organizations that were active in Crimea prior to the annexation by the Russian Federation. Since 2011, we have been working on protecting human rights in terms of interethnic and interfaith relations, and this is and remains the main thrust of our activities. In 2014, during the occupation, we actively looked for disappeared persons and we provided legal assistance to people detained by the security forces. Then, when Russia took Crimea under its jurisdiction, it declared the activities of Ukrainian national human rights institutions unlawful. Being a Ukrainian civil society organization, our work in Crimea was under threat and we were forced to re-register under Ukrainian law on the mainland, and a number of our members had to leave Crimea due to the threats to their security. The activities of Russian human rights organizations in Crimea has also been obstructed. In general, Russian human rights organizations do not recognize Crimea's annexation, and this stance means that the only way they can get to Crimea is through the legal route, which is through the territory of Ukraine, and there are obstacles that are imposed on them when they try to cross the border between Crimea and the Kherson Oblast of Ukraine. Human rights institutions which have emerged in Crimea come under huge amounts of pressure. We all know about the fate of the Crimean human rights activist Emir Hussein Kuku, who was arrested on suspicion of terrorism. Furthermore, there is pressure on lawyers, and there are raids in offices and attempts to seize documents or hardware. There are administrative arrests as well. In addition to this, the Crimean authorities trample all over all rights and hold people administratively accountable in such a way as to exert pressure on civil society activists who try to bring to public attention wrongful acts. The latest glaring example was the case of a one-man picket held by a 76-year-old man who appealed to the Russian authorities to stop persecuting the Crimean Tatars on spurious charges of terrorism and extremism. Because of this, he faces administrative proceedings, and he was sentenced to 10 days of arrest and a fine, despite his age, his state of health, and the fact that one-person pickets are actually lawful. These facts of unlawful acts, as well as the fictitious charges and the political slant of the criminal administrative proceedings that are brought, all shed light on the fight going on in Russia with people defending human rights and freedoms, and Russia, the authorities are trying to paralyze their work.
Which will be followed by Ukraine. Majlis of the Crimean Tatars, you have the floor.
Dear participants, my name is Narim Marjedarov, and I came to this meeting in Crimea, from Crimea, where, without taking into consideration the opinions of the Crimean Tatars, everything is being controlled by the Russian Federation. There we have identified regular violations of human rights by the administration apparatus in Crimea. Yesterday, on 11 September, the deputy president of the Majlis, my friend and colleague, Abdullah Shigoza, was sentenced to 8 years in prison, supposedly for violation of the organization of meetings, and yet in fact this was just a peaceful assembly when thousands of people came out onto the street to demonstrate in favor of their territorial integrity. Now, 8 years is the maximum sentence that can be handed down by Russian courts under the article, and such a severe sentence has not yet been handed down. This means that peaceful assembly is simply not possible on the territory of Crimea. These are people who do this are labeled as extremists, and it is very easy for them to sentence such people. The Russian legislation concerning the holding of assemblies is extremely strict, but even when the organizers follow the letter of the law, the authorities nevertheless prevent such assemblies. Let me give you a few examples. On 20 August of this year, activists of the National Movement of Crimean Tatars organized a 20th anniversary of the events in Moscow, and there was no ban, and referring to an anonymous protest, the forces of law and order simply occupied the public space where the assembly was to take place. So the Russian Federation is not fulfilling the decisions of 19 April of this year by the UN Committee about urgent measures to eliminate all forms of racial discrimination and to lift the ban on the activities of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatars. And dozens of activists who are members of the Majlis are under threat of judicial procedure in Crimea. Thank you for your attention.
Ukraine, followed by the Belarusian House in Warsaw. Ukraine, you have the floor.
Good morning, dear participants. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Ukraine is fully committed to protecting, strengthening and promoting the fundamental freedoms of peaceful assembly and association which are guaranteed by the Constitution of Ukraine in compliance with the applicable international standards. We remain deeply alarmed over the systemic violations of freedoms of peaceful assembly and association by the occupying authorities in Crimea and city of Sevastopol, targeting first and foremost Crimean Tatars and pro-Ukrainian activists, as well as by Russia-backed militants in central areas of Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Residents of those parts of Ukraine cannot freely exercise their right to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, and there were credible allegations of harassment, arbitrary arrest and torture against targeting activists. Independent civil society, including humanitarian organizations, remained unable to freely operate in the territory controlled by armed groups. Restrictions are also severely impacted the exercise of freedom of religion or belief, limiting the activities of minority Christian communities. We reiterate our protest against the ban by the Russian occupation authorities of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, which is a traditional institution of this indigenous people, and its members forming an executive body were elected by the Kurultai, the Crimean Tatars Assembly. The occupation authorities banned the traditional ceremonies in connection with anniversaries of deportation, peaceful assembly on the Crimean Tatar flag day, and many other important dates. That was the case for Kurseit Abdullayev, Leonid Kuzmin, and Alexander Kravchenko, who were detained and found guilty for displaying the Ukrainian flag and descriptions Crimea is Ukraine, which is so-called court considered to be symbols of extremist organizations. Ukraine consistently underscores its deep concern over the human rights situation in Russia and its significant departure in the past years from implementation of respective OSCE commitments. Ukraine repeatedly encourages the Russian Federation to consider inviting an OSCE human rights assessment mission to thoroughly examine the situation and elaborate respective recommendations in line with the OSCE commitments and international standards. Besides, we also appealed to the OSCE chairmanship and the OSCE autonomous institutions to use all available assets and instruments to monitor and react to the developments in Russia. These appeals remain highly relevant today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Belarusian House in Warsaw, followed by Romania. Belarusian House in Warsaw, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. A new massive wave of repression started in March-April this year with mass detentions of 700 peaceful demonstrators, journalists and human rights defenders, which took place in Minsk. Many of them were subjected to violence and ill treatment. In late March, KGB detained more than 30 people on fake charges on preparation of mass riots and participation in a illegal armed group. On the eve of OSCE Parliament Assembly session in Minsk in July this year, all the detainees were released, but charges remain in force. In August, Belarusian authorities started criminal prosecution of leaders of independent trade unions, arresting one of its leaders, Igor Komlik. Informal anarchists and anti-fascist associations declare that at least 10 persons were arrested and illegally tried or faced disproportionate sentences in connection with their public activities. These repressions even exceeded crackdown of December 2010, which became reason for OSCE reporter's report on the human rights situation in Belarus, the Moscow Mechanism report. Belarus has not implemented a single recommendation of the UN Human Rights Council resolution of 2011 and the OSCE Moscow Mechanism report of 2011. The government of Belarus does not cooperate with the international human rights mechanism on the most important problems of human rights and rule of law. It demonstratively ignores and challenges resolutions of the UN Human Rights Council, doesn't implement most of recommendations of the UN treaty bodies, and refuses to implement decisions of the UN Human Rights Committee on individual complaints in violation of its international obligations, which results in spiral of lawlessness and systematic violations of human rights in Belarus. International community should systematically assess the implementation by Belarus of its international obligations and recommendations and resolutions adopted by international bodies such as UN, OSCE and European Union since crackdown in 2009. The analysis and conclusions in these documents should serve as a legal framework and the basis for political and international community regarding Belarus. The existing monitoring mechanism regarding the situation in Belarus of the UN, the OSCE and Council of Europe should be extended and strengthened, including OSCE Parliament Assembly Working Group on Belarus. Any programs of international cooperation with assistance to Belarus should include strong human rights conditionality and involve civil society as a full-fledged participant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Romania, followed by the Association Crimean Central Lawyers Board of Simferopol. Romania, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Romania fully subscribes to the statement delivered by the British ambassador on behalf of the European Union. However, I would like to add in my national capacity a few remarks. First, I would like to underline the crucial role and contribution of ODIHR in the field of protection of human rights and express full support to its new director, Ms. Gilasdottir, in discharging her important mandate. While Romania and others are constantly pleading for involving the civil society in all dimensions of the OSCE work, we witness the widening of the gap in implementation of OSCE commitments within the OSCE area. Growing pressure on civil society, journalists and human rights defenders, undue restrictions on freedom of expression, media freedom and freedom of association and peaceful assembly. These are fundamental freedoms, the prerequisites of security and stability of OSCE area. Failure to respect the related commitments affect us all. Romania values the work of the civil society in pointing out the shortcomings in the implementation of the OSCE human dimension commitments in participating states. Only a strong and vibrant civil society is able to come up with concrete solutions to challenging situations. Human rights defenders, national human rights institutions, are actively taking part in positive changes at community and local level, and therefore, their work and genuine involvement is needed. Romania attaches great importance, Mr. Moderator, to the education in the field of human rights. In this regard, we encourage and support extracurricular education activities as an alternative to the formal learning system conducted by various educational institutions independently or in partnership with governmental or non-governmental organizations at local, regional, national and international level. Against this background, Romania would like to submit the recommendation that more attention be given to education in the field of human rights alongside with the involvement of civil society. In this respect, ODIHR and OSCE field presences have an important role to play. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Association of Crimean Central Lawyers Board of Simferopol, followed by Fair Trials. Crimean Central Lawyers Board of Simferopol, you have the floor.
Да, большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. My name is HDIM Semilyaev. I am a lawyer and I often work on politically motivated trials in Crimea. The freedom of assembly is a fundamental freedom in any country, and it is essential for ensuring the exercise of political and civil rights. There are international acts and this right is also enshrined in the Constitution of the Russian Federation, which currently governs Crimea. The Russian Federation's laws foresee that it is legal to hold marches and demonstrations and pickets. Today in Crimea, activists are prohibited from carrying out such demonstrations, and the annual meetings have been banned concerning the deportation of Crimean Tatars, which was a demonstration which had taken place annually for 25 years. Furthermore, entire districts were closed off and people were not allowed on the streets. When people gather and that affects public transportation, everything is labeled as an unauthorized meeting and punished by fines of varying amounts. People are also threatened with administrative punishments for coming to support their friends or acquaintances who face unfair trials. If people gather, for instance, to denounce certain cases, they are accused of holding an unauthorized meeting. There were not necessarily arrests, but we do expect that there will be arrests. Even one-person pickets in Crimea are now prohibited. In August, Mr. Karametov was arrested. He is a 76-year-old man who was arrested and fined for 10,000 rubles, and he was sentenced to 10 days imprisonment. terrorism and extremism charges have become a means of cracking down on dissent and of silencing critical views. If people try to gather and express their views, that is something that should be protected because it is the only way to make sure that societies don't become weaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Fair Trials, followed by Azerbaijan. Fair Trials, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Jago Rossell from Fair Trials. Last month, Dogan Kanli, a German-Turkish writer, was arrested on an Interpol red notice issued by Turkey. His arrest was rightly condemned by the OSCE's representative on media freedom and was also condemned by Chancellor Merkel, who said that international organizations like Interpol must not be misused in this way. Sadly, Mr. Akanli's arrest is just one of many. It's the latest case of abuse of international cooperation mechanisms and in particular Interpol. I'll start with the recommendations. I have 3 recommendations as to how the OSCE and its member countries can prevent or reduce the human impact of the abuse of these international cooperation mechanisms and in particular Interpol. The first recommendation for states: think before you arrest people within your jurisdiction. Sounds really obvious, but the existence of an Interpol red notice does not mean that it's a legitimate arrest request. These red notices are misused, so you should think before you arrest people. Secondly, continue to encourage and support reform of Interpol. Interpol has started down the route to meaningful reform of its systems to prevent their misuse for political purposes, but the pressure needs to be maintained for those reforms to be implemented properly. And finally, I believe the OSCE should play a key role in bridging the apparent divide sometimes between protecting security and also the human rights dimensions. It's absolutely crucial that states find ways to cooperate to fight serious cross-border crime, but those mechanisms also need to be adapted and used in a way which respects human rights. This is crucially important. It's crucially important because of the impact of abuse of these systems on the individuals concerned, because of the human impact. It's crucially important that we tackle this problem because civil society leaders, journalists, human rights defenders living in exile can play a hugely important role in advancing democracy and human rights in the countries that they've had to flee. We need to protect these people and enable them to continue their activism from exile. And finally, it's crucially important because we need international policing and cooperation mechanisms now that police and states can trust. States and police should be able to trust Interpol red notices as being legitimate tools for cooperation, not mechanisms for exporting persecution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Azerbaijan, followed by Pax Europa. Azerbaijan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, respect to human rights and fundamental freedoms is one of the main principles of international law and is the basis of interstate relations. Moreover, respect to human rights and freedoms is an integral part of international security system. From this point of view, OSCE as an organization, also OSCE member states should not be indifferent to violations of common norms and principles of international law. Human rights and international humanitarian law should not keep silence, should join efforts for punishing states which committed the violations in order to avoid new violation. I would like to note that very recently, on July 4th, 2017, residential settlements resided densely by civil population in Al-Khanli village of Izuli district and civil facilities were fired in a targeted manner and with large caliber weapons by Armenian armed force, as a result of which an elderly woman and her 2-year-old granddaughter were killed. Another civilian woman was seriously injured and civil facilities were destroyed. As a result of the next provocation committed by the Armenian armed forces on August 7, 2017, with the goal of deliberate destruction of the civilians by firing the Karalar village of Tavuz region bordering with Armenia, 13-year-old boy from that village, Yusuf Ramin, was hospitalized in heavy conditions by receiving multi-type debris injuries. As seen, Armenia is a continuous route violations of the requirements of international humanitarian legal norms by intensively firing the territories of civilians with large caliber weapons without giving up its aggressive action. These recent incidents should be assessed as a next criminal act, being the continuation of military aggression, ethnic cleansing, and terror act lasting over the 25 years against Azerbaijan, resulting with the killing of thousands innocent people by the Armenian armed forces, the grave and mass violation of human rights, and full destruction of historical, religious, and cultural monuments belonging to the world culture, and efficient measures should be taken for punishing those who commit these crimes in line with international legal norms. As known, resolutions of the Right of Truth Human Rights Council invites member states,
I think there is a point of order.
International organizations, national human rights institutions, and non-governmental organizations.
Sorry, a point of order. I must interrupt you. I think there is a point of order.
From the very beginning, you have established the rule of the House, the rule of procedure, that each delegation should perform in the scope of the discussion. The situation in conflict area is neither civil society NGO event nor freedom of assembly. So I would like to urge you to keep your own pledges of the meeting. I mean, we are discussing completely different issues. We understand that Azerbaijani delegation has nothing to say on freedom of association and also on the NGO, and it tries to hijack the topic of this meeting by bringing completely different topics. So I urge you to interfere and to bring the order. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you very much.
I would like to say about the resolutions of the about the United Nations councils.
Okay,
and the
please
United Councils also invite.
Please stick to the topics of the session. Freedom of assembly and association and natural rights.
As
you have the floor.
Okay. As known, adopting the resolution of the Right to Truth Human Rights Council invites member states, United Nations bodies, intergovernmental organizations, national human rights institutions, and non-governmental organizations to fully implement the demands of the resolutions. The right of truth is often invoked in the context of gross violation of human rights and grave breach of humanitarian law. The right of the truth implies knowing the full and complete truth as a event that transpired, the specific circumstances, and who participated in them, including knowing the circumstances in which the violations took place, as well as the reason for them. And Azerbaijan Ombudsman, as a national human rights institution, guiding with the requirements of the respective of the UN Human Rights Councils, adopted statements, appeals addressed to the world community, respective international organizations, and colleagues for putting an end long-lasting Armenian aggression against Azerbaijan.
Sorry, a kind reminder really to try to stick to the topic of the session, assembly and association and NHRIs.
It's one of the activities of national human rights institutions to give you attention about the gross violations of Azerbaijani civilians. If it's not, please correct me.
As I mentioned, the topic is freedom of assembly and association and
national
the role
human rights institutions
national
activity.
human rights institutions
and
civil
now
society.
I'm showing you about our statements, about the statement of national human rights institutions, which gross violations will be happening in Azerbaijan by Armenian military service. It's also gross violation. Please keep the anti-discrimination activity, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and a kind reminder to everybody of the topics of this session: freedom of assembly, freedom of association, the role of national human rights institutions and civil society. Now, the next speaker on the list is Pax Europa, which will be followed by the Islamic Renaissance Party. Pax Europa, you have the floor.
Herzlichen Dank. Ich heiße Elisabeth Sabat.
Thank you very much. My name is Lislibica Sabic and I represent Pax Europa, and it is with grave concern that we note more and more restrictions on freedom of assembly in Austria. A number of groups that defend the right to life and that want to preserve a classic model of the family with a father, a mother, and a child or children are in fact subject to violent counter demonstrations. For instance, the March for the Family that was planned for 18 June was subject to difficulties. Already last year, we were told that there would be a counter-demonstration, even though we had asked for a permit to march much earlier. This year, the march had to be interrupted because anarchist groups threatened to attack the participants in the march violently, and the police claimed that it was not in a position to guarantee the safety of march participants. And this example shows that in Austria, violent groups have a monopoly when it comes to the use of public space, and the right of assembly and association of certain groups is violated de facto by the authority. And Pax Europa is calling upon Austrian authorities to guarantee the right to freedom of assembly, that this freedom of assembly and association, especially peaceful assembly, be fully reinstated. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Islamic Renaissance Party, which will be followed by Political Movement Group 24. Islamic Renaissance Party, you have the floor.
I want to talk about the role of civil society in Tajikistan, in the protection of human rights in Tajikistan. My country, where violations of human rights, especially in recent years, is widespread, and human rights defenders and activists pay high price for their engagement in this issue. I would like to draw your attention to a very negative phenomenon regarding civil society in Tajikistan. There are some pro-government groups which call themselves as part of civil society, but their main goals are not their protection of human rights, rather crushing opposition and their family members, which lead to a large violations of human rights. For example, there is a group called Avant-Garde or Sozandagoni Vatan, Homeland Builders. It is the youth wing of the ruling party, led by President Emomali Rahman. Members of this group are free to hold anti-opposition rallies in front of activists' homes, block the streets, throw stones into the houses of activists, threaten their family members, and even cause mass unrest. They break into Western embassies in Tajikistan and demand extraditions of political activists who live in exile in Europe. Members of this group, Avant-Garde, in these days when OSCE conference in Warsaw was being held, organized rallies outside the offices of OSCE in Khujan and Dushanbe, demanding extradition of Tajik activists, what they called traitors to their country, who participated in these conferences last year, like Muhiddin Kabiri and Ms. Shabnam Khudodoydova. Unfortunately, the Tajik government had adopted a policy of intimidation, blackmail, as well as physical and physiological terror towards civil society and activists. Muhiddin Kabiri, chairman of the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, is right when he said the government labeled activists and its opponents radicals and extremists, but it uses extremist methods itself. In the end, I want to say pro-government Avant-Garde and similar groups are not builders of homeland. Rather, they are destroyers of our beautiful homeland. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Before we move on to the next speaker, I have an announcement, a request to make, which is completely unrelated to the topic of this session, but is somewhat urgent. We were just told that somebody parked their car in the designated parking spot for persons with disabilities. The car in question is a silver Toyota SUV with a number plate of BI0544L. In case it is your car, please urgently move it to another parking slot. Apologies for this interruption on something completely unrelated, and I'm now moving on to our next speaker. The next speaker is the Political Movement Group 24, which will be followed by the Public Union Civil Movement April, Political Movement Group 24. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Activist Political Movement Group 24, Said Ali Ashurov. The freedom of peaceful assembly and association. The freedom of peaceful assembly and association is the milestone of democracy, a fundamental freedom, in according to the Article 20 of the Universal Declaration. And all participant states have committed to protect peaceful assembly and respect the right of individuals to associate with others. But unfortunately, authoritarian regime in Tajikistan is not respect his obligation toward international human rights declaration. Organizing any kind of public association or peaceful assembly, such social, political, and religious, for expressing their opinions and criticizing the state on violating of human rights is restricted and considered a crime by the last legislation. The organizer of peaceful assembly and association will be sentenced by the criminal codes of the country. For example, the head of Political Movement Group 24, after announcing a peaceful demonstration and criticizing the regime for corruption, was assassinated by regime in Turkey. The head of Yad for Revival of Tajikistan for peaceful demonstration in different cities of Russian Federation was attacked in Moscow and illegally extradited to Tajikistan and detained for 17 years. The ex-Minister of Energy of Tajikistan for establishing a political party, New Tajikistan, was convicted for 29 years. The inventor of Advocates Collective for protecting civilian rights, convicted for 23 years. All the above persons were sentenced by the allegation for taking the government by force and organizing such groups, and punished according to the following criminal codex: calling for extremism, calling for taking the state by force, responsibility for organizing terrorist groups, organizing criminal groups, abusing president in public. Civil society is one of the powerful body part in the country which can act for protecting civilian rights and declaring their issues. But unfortunately, civil society in Tajikistan still are under the pressure and controlling of the regime. Pressures on civil society started from November 2014 behind passing a legislation on draft amendment on law of public association. The legislation involved limitation and controlling their funds, activities, and relations with foreign sponsors. Finally, the regime called majority of the civil society agents of foreign countries. Before passing this legislation, more than 90 associations appealed against this legislation, but unfortunately, there was no any response. This is what Rahmanov claims about the democracy in the country. After long pressure on civilians, many advocates, journalists, politicians, and free thinkers leave the country for abroad. The regime continued his pressure and tortures on their families. Finally, activists of civil society of Tajikistan, a request from the international communities and democratic organizations to support the civil society for implementing their responsibilities on protecting human rights in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Public Union Civil Movement April, followed by Poland. Public Union Civil Movement April, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Уважаемые дамы.
Ladies and gentlemen, the OSCE formula includes this concept, which we put into practice in Kyrgyzstan. Human rights start from the human person themselves, and the rights of one person end where the rights of another begin. And this simple formula can provide a solution between minorities and the minority and the majority, and for those who seek to solve problems. In our country, 6 years ago, well, until 6 years ago, there were thousands of meetings that took place every year. And I'm sad to say that now meetings and demonstrations have almost stopped taking place altogether. There are a few that happen. But problems are resolved more expediently. And so we need to find a new formula through which the minority can resolve their issues. For instance, in Bishkek, we have a park, the Park Gorkova, where we provide information and we inform the town council that we would be holding a meeting there. We received authorization, and for 7 years we have been holding a meeting there, and we just need to inform them of when we hold the meetings and what the meetings are about. So if within the OSCE region we could spread a simple formula which would be clear to all, well then minority views could use that formula. When there are street demonstrations, there are a lot of people who are not interested in the theme behind the demonstration, and they can get in the way. And so, as you see, we have a rather positive experience in Bishkek. We have designated a park where demonstrations are authorized, and all we need to do then is inform the authorities about what the demonstration is going to be about. So, in a sense, it's about mathematics. A person was... Copernicus was condemned for having said that the Earth revolved around the sun, and Galileo was also persecuted. But you see, I think that every problem and every demonstration, every meeting needs a certain mathematical formula to be solved, and then things will be clearer and better understood. I think that the time has come where for each problem a formula needs to be used, one that is straightforward and clear to all. Thank you.
The next speaker is Poland, followed by the Open Dialogue Foundation. Poland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Agnieszka Rymsza. I represent the Department of Civil Society at the Chancellery of the Prime Minister in Poland. And I would like to present to you the concept of the National Institute of Freedom Center for the Development of Civil Society, which is a part of the current Polish government commitment towards strengthening civil society organizations and activities. The current version of the Act on the National Institute, or rather the Act draft, is a result of the broad dialogue with the civil society actors in Poland. The consultation process lasted 6 weeks, and everybody could participate in 23 information consultation conferences held during the consultation process across the whole country. The main idea behind the planned creation of the National Institute of Freedom is the creation of a government institution that would be fully devoted to the implementation of government programs strengthening the development of civil society in Poland. The idea and organizational structure of the National Institute of Freedom benefits from the good practices of other, also OSCE countries, which was also acknowledged in the recent opinion of the draft act issued by the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. The Institute is planning to run programs that aim to strengthen civil society and civil society actors in Poland, such as Institutional Grants Fund, civic education grants, programs supporting advocacy and watchdog activities of Polish organizations, civic participation of Polish citizens, as well as the Polish Solidarity Corps, programs supporting long-term volunteering. The special attention will be given to providing support to organizations that so far had little chances of receiving government support, to balance chances and facilitate diversification of the civil society sector in Poland. The theme of the programs are the response to problems of Polish non-profit sector and civil society voiced for many years by civil society actors and revealed in various research and discussions. Programs to be run by the National Institute will be developed in cooperation with special expert groups of civil society representatives and will be open to public consultation. The Institute is to function in a transparent manner and will be open to social control through the Council of the Institute that will assist the committee in supervising the Institute and which will have representatives on non-profit organizations. The draft on National Institute of Freedom Center for the Development of Civil Society is now being processed in the Polish Parliament and is expected to be passed within a month. I have copies of the full text of my presentation with my contact details in case you would like to learn more about the Institute, our policies towards strengthening civil society in Poland, or if you would like to cooperate with our department. They will be available outside. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Open Dialogue Foundation, followed by the National Bar Association of the Republic of Moldova. Open Dialogue Foundation, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ludmila Kozlovska. I represent Open Dialogue Foundation, a human rights organization which monitors the situation in post-Soviet region. Today, I would like to draw your attention to the violation of the freedom of assembly in Moldova and Kazakhstan. Since 2015, in Moldova, the anti-government protests regularly organized across the country, involving thousands of protesters. Initially, they were provoked by the news of loss of about $1 billion from 3 large Moldovan banks. Shortly, the protesters began to make general demands, resignation of the government and the implementation of anti-corruption reforms. The current government, formed mainly from persons close to oligarch Vladimir Plakhatnyuk, sabotaged implementation of systematic reform. Furthermore, in response to the protests, the Moldovan authorities began to prosecute opposition and civil society representatives such as Maya Sandu, Andrei Anastasi, Grigory Petrenko, Alexander Makidon, Anna Ursaki, and others. For the first time in several years, the international community has noted the presence of political prisoners in the country. The concentration of power in the hands of Vladimir Plakhatnyuk, the most powerful oligarch and the most influential politician in the country, poses a threat for democratic process in Moldova. In Kazakhstan, almost 6 years after Zhanaozen tragedy, the authorities are suppressing freedom of assembly by arresting and sentencing critics and opponents of Nazarbayev's regime. The European Parliament, the OSCE, the United Nations condemned Nazarbayev's repressive policy and called for the release of political prisoners. Thanks to this pressure, a lot of political prisoners, including Vladimir Kozlov and Rosa Tulitaeva, were conditionally released. As Open Dialogue Foundation, we deeply concerned that since 2016, Talgat Ayan and Max Bakayev, land reform protesters, were sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for attending a peaceful rally and publishing in social media. And the blogger Sanat Dosov was sentenced for 3 years imprisonment for his criticism of Russian aggression in Ukraine and in social media. In 2017, leaders of oil workers Amin Eliusinov and Nurbek Kushkambayev were sentenced to 2 and 2.5 years after protesting against the closure of Confederation of Independent Labor Unions. The Open Dialogue Foundation considers it necessary for OSCE states to take the following steps. Exert pressure on the Moldovan authorities in order to bring about the implementation of the necessary anti-corruption reform in the country and measures to ensure the independence of the law enforcement and judicial system. Demand from Moldova and Kazakhstan safe conditions for activities of opposition and civil society, labor unions and countries in the countries, and unconditionally stop political persecutions. The full list of recommendations will be tabled later after this meeting. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the National Bar Association of the Republic of Moldova, followed by Citizens Labor Rights Protection League. National Bar Association of the Republic of Moldova, you have the floor.
Sorry, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anna Ursaki. I'm a lawyer and human rights defender from Moldova. As it was already specified in different international reports and it was observed by the foreign experts, Moldova remains one of the poorest and most corrupt states in Europe, which causes tension in society and discontent with the actions of the authorities. The whole year of 2015 and the winter, spring and summer of 2016 were marked by anti-government protests across the country involving thousands of protesters. As a result, on the direct order of Vladimir Plakhatnyuk, who is the most afraid of popular protests and loss of power, the fully controlled by the oligarch General Prosecution Office, opened and fabricated criminal cases against the leaders of the opposition and civil activists who were supposed to be organizers of peaceful anti-government protests. Plahotniuc ordered and the law enforcement institution of Moldova executed targeted attacks against any kind of opposition to government. And we can talk here about the illegal detention of the leader of the opposition party, AUHO Moldova, Grigore Petrenko, who was arrested after protests in front of General Prosecutor Office and who is now recognized by the statement of Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe and the written declaration of United States Department as a political prisoner. I can also mention here the huge media harassment and threats of the criminal prosecution against the other prominent leaders of opposition who were organized and participated at the joint opposition protests of left and right parties, which were held from the spring 2015 to the summer 2016 in Moldova. Moreover, journalists, civil activists, lawyers, human rights defenders are beginning to be prosecuted for their independent position, for free expressed during the protest actions opinion, for making public big corruption cases about contraband of drugs and anabolics, about stealing public money, about human being traffics and other crimes in which different persons from the near circle of Plahotniuc and Plahotniuc itself had been involved. On 27 August 2016, on the Independence Day of Moldova, a peaceful anti-government protest, Action Numatem, it means I'm not afraid, was held in Chisinau. The activists gathered near the square where a military parade took place and chanted opposition slogans. The police arrived in the square and sprayed tear gas into the crowd. I was one of the victims, and I have to mention that police didn't stop spreading the gas. Even they noticed that among the protesters were being children and elderly people. Amnesty International condemned justified use of tear gas, but the most awful thing is that after several big protests were held in front of Plahotniuc House and his office, the Moldovan parliament adopted a draft law that allows the involvement of armed force in order to counterattack protest actions and ensure so-called public order. This means that the authorities, and I am summing up here, do not want to engage in a dialogue with the public and expect to suppress protest sentiment by force, as is done in other undemocratic post-Soviet states. But we are still talking about Moldova, the country which had signed the association agreement with the European Union. And so we really need your support and to put pressure on our government to stop these illegal actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Citizens Labor Rights Protection League, followed by Eurasian Dialogue. Citizens Labor Rights Protection League, you have the floor.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Unfortunately, the situation of human rights defenders in the OSCE region is continuing to deteriorate, and the right to assembly is being limited more and more. On the one hand, the authorities are using various legal acts to reduce the actions or limit the actions of NGOs, and the rights or the powers of the apparatus of the state to limit what NGOs do are being increased more and more, and journalists who are independent are being limited in their action. Others are being used to intimidate civil society, and more human rights defenders are becoming victims of the system. Now, if anyone is worried about the fate of activists in our countries, then I think that it is important to combat organizations that are using various networks to launder dirty money. There will be a side event held here, which is then funded by certain dubious donors. And in the countries of the former Soviet Union, like Azerbaijan, they are interested in some closer links with the EU through the signing of various trade and commercial agreements. But who is going to be monitoring the actions carried out under the cover of such agreements? People are sent from one event to another, they read out the same text, and they masquerade as human rights activists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was just discussing with colleagues, we have quite a long list of rights of reply requests. And therefore, unfortunately, to give space to everybody, including those delegations who have expressed their interest in exercising the right of reply, we will limit now speaking time to 2 minutes, and with a kind request to try to stick to this time. The next speaker on my list is the Eurasian Dialogue, which will be followed by Act for America Minneapolis. Eurasian Dialogue, you have the floor.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, respected representative of countries to OCSE, my name is Mohammad John Kabirov. I would like to speak today about freedom of peaceful assembly. In some countries there is a limitation in this regard, but our problem as a Tajik activist is different and another sort of pressure. We as a peaceful activist were crushed in our country. Many of us were sentenced to long-term imprisonment, and some of us could survive and sought refuge in Europe. Despite all this, we cannot use freely our right of freedom of peaceful assembly and association in Europe, because Tajikistan government use our family members and relatives as a hostage and human shields to silence us. Due to my participation to this conference, my father, Safar Kabirov, was detained and in custody in Faizabad district. He was subjected to torture, humiliation, harsh integration, and inhuman treatment while his hand was held in chain. They threatened him with imprisonment if I participate in this conference with you. Last year in this city, in such a conference, mother of an activist, Abdus Samad, who was participated in human domination implementation meeting in 2016, has died of the heart attack following the raid and threats of security officials. She was so afraid and stressed that led to her attack, and result, he has died. Similar, Janatullah Kamilov, an IRP team activist who is now with us here. His mother has died of high blood pressure when the authority used their regular raid her home and threatened her and her sons with imprisonment, confiscation of their house and properties. Now my colleagues, Mr. Islamuddin Saidov, an activist who organized the yesterday protest outside of the hall, told me that authority went to his father's home and forced them out of their home. The authority told his father, "We had told you to tell your son not to participate in Warsaw conference, but your son has organized an anti-government protest outside the OCSE conference hall." If the country, if the government and authority do not tolerate the freedom of assembly of their opposition in Central Europe, how they could tolerate their opposition inside the country? So I kindly request, do not keep silence in this case. If the OCSE organization and human implementation meeting raised this question last year, we wouldn't be today under pressure. So please don't be quiet. Why should our family members pay the price for our activities? So I kindly ask, impose sanction on these family abusers who call themselves as human. And OCSE should create a committee to visit our family members and in general to observe this inhuman phenomenon. Thanks a lot for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And again, a kind request to try to stick to the limited time we have in the forthcoming interventions. The next speaker I have on my list is the Act for America Minneapolis, which will be followed by the Union of Informed Citizens. Act for America Minneapolis, you have the floor.
Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I am Deborah Anderson, speaking on behalf of Act for America. We used to hold many public rallies, but the emergence of Antifa in America and the lack of policing has caused severe deterioration of freedom of peaceful assembly. Last June, rallies hosted by Act for America across the country were met by counter-protesters dressed in black masks and hoods, and some armed with pepper spray, homemade shields, and water bottles. This also has the effect of radicalizing any assembly, so only those willing to engage in physical battles will participate. The safety of participants in a proposed Act for America rally for the Constitution could not be guaranteed, so Act for America decided to give up holding the planned public assemblies. This in itself constitutes a direct loss of a fundamental freedom. The remedy urgently needed is effective policing where threats and violence from so-called counter-demonstrators are effectively prevented. This will require use of physical force, but experience from Poland and Spain prove this to be effective. Therefore, Act for America Minneapolis recommends that police and other authorities clearly differentiate between perpetrators and victims of violence, that police effectively protect any peaceful assembly against intimidation, threats, and attacks using any force that may be necessary, that violent groups attacking freedom of peaceful assembly be investigated and prosecuted under the law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Union of Informed Citizens, which will be followed by the Central Asian and Southern Caucasian Freedom of Expression Network. Union of Informed Citizens, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Speaking of the role of civil society in the protection of human rights, one cannot ignore the shrinking space of CSOs in number of OSCE member states. Fortunately, Armenia, my country, is not the first in the list of those countries. The picture is worse in Russia, Belarus, Azerbaijan, and some other Central Asian countries. But it does not mean that we can ignore the tendencies of shrinking space of civil society in Armenia. By now it is mostly expressed in propaganda. For example, the public television has prepared reports to justify the fact that human rights defenders receive money from the West for anti-state activities. And in recent months there has been an extremely problematic tendency associated with shrinking space of lawyers' activities. For several months, judicial bailiff has been doing illegal searches against lawyers attending courts. Tomorrow, on September 13, more than 150 lawyers will hold a one-day strike to demand to stop these searches. I should add that by now we have good legislation regarding NGOs and media, but calls to change the legislation in Armenia are regularly made by Moscow. Regarding peaceful assemblies in Armenia, I would like to mention that there are peaceful demonstrators in Armenia who are still imprisoned for more than a year. So far, not a single person who abused the use of special means and force against peaceful protesters and journalists in June 2015 and July 2016 has been punished. As a result, many people in Armenia have started to be afraid of participating in peaceful assemblies because they have no reason to think that they will not be poisoned with tear gas, will not get burns or shrapnel injuries from stun grenades, or will not appear in jail, as it happened with hundreds of exclusively peaceful protesters in the last 2 years. We think that OSCE should call on Armenia to bring police officers who used violence against peaceful protests to the account. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Southern Caucasus Freedom of Expression Network, which will be followed by the European Network for National Human Rights Institutions. Central Asia and Southern Caucasus Freedom of Expression Network, you have the floor.
Thank you. As Eurasviet, I represent the Central Asian and Southern Caucasian Freedom of Expression organization. Now, I don't have much time, so I will focus on a few key elements. My organization is based in Azerbaijan and is one of a few thousand NGOs that freely and without hindrance carry out their activities throughout our country. Our organization usually holds multiple events in all parts of our country, and in particular in the central region of our country and in the capital as well. We do not run up against any hindrance from the authorities. We do not face any difficulties. I want to say this so that everyone knows that in Azerbaijan, no obstacles are imposed on NGOs, unlike what some people here would have you think. The representative of the United States said during the statement that some NGOs have blocked bank accounts. I am surprised to hear that because at this point in time we have no data proving that about Azerbaijan. Now, probably the representatives of the United States might review their statement, and I think they're actually rereading the statement that they read last year. And last year I had to respond to what they said. They said that NGOs' bank accounts in Azerbaijan were blocked, but that was not the case. Unfortunately, we have little time, and so I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions, followed by the Helsinki Citizens Assembly Vanadzor. European Network of National Human Rights Institutions, you have...
Thank you. National human rights institutions are state-mandated organizations, independent of governments, with a broad mandate to promote and protect human rights. NHRIs can have various forms and include ombudsman institutions or also human rights commissions. All NHRIs, though, are accredited against the Paris Principles to ensure their independence, impartiality, accountability, and pluralism. ENRI, the European Network of NHRIs, which I represent today, brings together 41 NHRIs from across Europe. ENRI's mission is to strengthen, support, and connect European NHRIs in order to enhance the promotion and protection of human rights across the region, including also the right to freedom of assembly and association. We recommend all OSCE participating states to establish and support NHRIs in compliance with the Paris Principles and enable their independent functioning, including to cooperate with and protect human rights defenders under threat. Being independent institutions fully dedicated to the promotion and protection of human rights, NHRIs in compliance with the Paris Principles are recognized by the UN and European organizations as being human rights defenders themselves. NHRIs have a legal mandate to advise state authorities on how to better implement their human rights obligations and to enhance public awareness of human rights. Through their independent human rights monitoring and reporting work, as well as their complaints handling functions, NHRIs also hold governments to account when human rights are being violated. NHRIs carry out their work in close cooperation with other human rights defenders, including civil society organizations and European partners such as OSCE ODIHR. In the context of shrinking democratic space in Europe, the effective cooperation amongst and protection of human rights defenders become both more challenging and important. ENRI is gearing up its work in order to cooperate with and protect human rights defenders across Europe and to uphold the rule of law and democratic space. In these challenging contexts of today, NHRIs themselves also become increasingly under threat. And therefore, NHRIs themselves and ENRI also would warmly welcome any cooperation with any of you who are dedicated to the further enabling the protection, the enabling environment for human rights defenders, including NHRIs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Helsinki Citizens Assembly Vanadzor, followed by Uzbekistan. Helsinki Citizens Assembly Vanadzor, you have the floor.
Thank you. And after the remark made by the Armenian government delegate yesterday, it seems that I should start my speech by saying thank you for allowing to be here and for the belief that I won't be prosecuted when I go back. And the only problem is that the delegation actually thinks this is a manifestation of their goodwill and not an obligation under the OSCE. This is exactly how freedoms are presented in Armenia, a gift that could be arbitrarily taken away. Within the last years, violations during assemblies became particularly violent, with arrests and apprehensions multiplying disproportionately every year. The rhetoric of maintaining public order has been largely abused by the Armenian authorities at the expense of freedom of assembly. Protesters, activists, and reporters were coercedly apprehended and taken to the police stations from the assembly venues arbitrarily without any legal grounds. In 2014, for example, there were only 106 persons apprehended, while in 2016 the number rose to around 1,000. And we're talking only about peaceful assemblers, not different other incidents that have been taking place. There have been several threats, attacks, and criminal cases brought against advocates. There is also a new tendency, as my colleague mentioned, about for searches of defense attorneys in courts and in prisons and arbitrary application of disciplinary sanctions against them. The reports on police violations submitted to the authorities are not properly investigated, whereas there is always harsh prosecution of any alleged crime or violence against the law enforcement officer. The purely political nature of the prosecutions during these assemblies is illustrated in the case of former candidate to the presidency, Andreas Lukasyan, who, during the hearing of deciding on his detention term, was asked by the court if he would continue his political activity after being released, and as he said yes, his detention term was extended. Monitoring of assemblies revealed that police officers responsible for maintaining public order carried firearms during 5 assemblies in 2016. At least 20 officers carried firearms during a march to the embassy of the Russian Federation. And this is clear because there is an obvious selective approach to controlling assemblies and of could be perceived as a threat to Russian interests or that have some political character. The attacks against civil society are committed officially through defamation charges or false statement charges, or unofficially through Russia-funded organizations that claim to protect Armenian traditional values and family values and attack anything that is pro-European or perceived as such.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Uzbekistan, followed by Centre de la Protection Internationale. Uzbekistan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I am the Uzbekistan. We have a national system of institutes for the protection of human rights. We have a plenipotentiary of the Majlis for protection of human rights. We have a representative of the president that protects the rights of businesses, and then we have the National Human Rights Center of Uzbekistan. Now, 2017 has been a time of historic decisions in the sphere of human rights protection and allowing for development of NGOs. Let me mention the most important. First of all, a law on the protection of the rights and interests of entrepreneurs, and a second law was enacted on the representative of the parliament, the plenipotentiary of the parliament on human rights, who's essentially the ombudsman, and the right of the ombudsman to appeal to the Constitutional Court without payment of any fees, making reports to the Parliament, and having an independent budget within the state budget. And there has also been a strengthening of cultural rights. Taking advantage of the opportunity, I'd like to note that in developing these laws, the representative of the OSCE in Uzbekistan was very involved. We organized a number of international events, and we also took advantage of recommendations of Dr. Yosef Osudi, who is the president of the Association of Ombudsmen. And we also took a number of important steps to develop non-governmental and non-commercial organizations. The full text of our statement will be made available electronically. Thank you for your attention.
International, followed by the Independent Association of Independent Democrats Against Authoritarian Regimes. Centre de la Protection Internationale, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I represent Centre de la Protection Internationale, France, and would like to bring to your attention a few facts concerning violations of the right to freedom of assembly in the Russian Federation and Armenia. With your permission, I would like to start with the Russian Federation. Russian authorities continue to practice the use of administrative arrests and detentions of peaceful demonstrators. On 26 March 2017, anti-corruption demonstrations and solo pickets were held in 82 cities of Russia. Up to 100,000 citizens took part in these demonstrations against corruption among Russian high-ranked officials, including the Prime Minister of the country. The Russian authorities dispersed the demonstrations and apprehended up to 1,800 peaceful protesters, including opposition leaders. On 12 June 2017, another peaceful mass demonstration took place in about 150 cities, during which more than 1,800 protesters were arrested. On 16 April 2017, another peaceful anti-corruption demonstration was held in Sochi, the organizer of which was arrested and kept under pre-trial detention for more than 24 hours without anything to eat and leaving alone the possibility to have a sleep. On the same day, about 28 other demonstrators were arrested in St. Petersburg. I would like to have a few words about Armenia as well. In 2015 and 16, mass demonstrations were held in Yerevan, during which dozens of peaceful demonstrators were arrested and severely beaten up by the police. During these demonstrations, opposition leaders were also detained. I would like to emphasize once again that Mr. Gugasyan, one of the opposition leaders, is detained till now, and this detention is for his political activities, which was explicitly stated in the National Court's decision on the application of detention as a measure of restraint. It should also be stated that no effective investigation into the aforementioned violations has been carried out by the RA authorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Independent Association of Independent Democrats Against Authoritarian Regimes, followed by European Law Association. Independent Association of Independent Democrats Against Authoritarian Regimes, you have the floor.
Государства диктатуры
Azerbaijan, Belarus, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and aggressive Russia are authoritarian countries. Kazakhstan has been making steps towards democracy. There are changes in terms of Western countries' policies towards dictators, which are softening. In Turkmenistan, freedoms are strongly restricted or non-existent, and social rights associations are restricted. There are no political rights, and we also welcome the development of Human Rights Watch in Kazakhstan. In Tajikistan, the family oligarch dictatorship has been consolidated, and gongos are flourishing. Democratic NGOs are oppressed. The authorities impede them from accessing resources or just repress them. And there are hundreds of activists in prison. In Russia, the authorities have decided to label all foreign NGOs as foreign agents. And in Belarus, despite finally registering Tell the Truth, the government refuses to register other human rights and political organizations. And there are criminal law proceedings brought against REP and its representatives. Please listen, European delegations. The National Institutes for Protection of Human Rights do exist formally in some countries, but they do not actually protect human rights. Belarus discussed the issue of the Ombudsman, and on the 2nd of February, the dictator Lukashenko said that we do not need the direct role of an ombudsman, and human rights will only be protected when the president is the ombudsman. And so he used the future, and so there is, as such, no ombudsman right now. Lukashenko, who's dictator and has been in power for 23 years, is concentrated on just one thing. To whom can he hand down the country? A leopard won't change its stripes. This is a major problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is European Law Association, followed by Freedom Now. European Law Association, you have the floor. Is there a representative of European Law Association? If not, then I suggest we move to the next speaker, Freedom Now.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity to address the OSCE on behalf of Freedom Now, an organization that works on arbitrary detention and rule of law worldwide. We continue to observe with concern the use by authorities of civil society through a slew of tactics, including legislation such as NGO registration laws still in use in Azerbaijan, dominance and control of the media, and we especially condemn the misuse of the judiciary to imprison individuals for exercising the right to association throughout the OSCE territories. I note with special alarm today Tajikistan, where observers note considerable curtailment of assembly and association rights, deficiencies in the rule of law, and particularly abuse of the Interpol Red Notice system. Since 2015, the government of Tajikistan has arrested and imprisoned nearly 200 political opposition members and sentenced them to lengthy prison terms on charges to discredit and dismantle any viable political opposition. Deeply concerning, the government has also imprisoned and harassed lawyers who represent these prisoners. The government's primary target in the crackdown is the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, or IRPT. The government ordered the party to close and banned its operations in 2019, thus hereby making it a civil society organization. Shortly thereafter, the government accused IRPT of initiating a failed coup. Mamadli Hayat is the deputy chairman of IRPT and one of a dozen top leaders arrested for allegedly participating in this coup. He was sentenced to life in prison after a closed trial. A second example is Zayed Sayed, a businessman and former Tajik government official. He was arrested in May 2013 after he announced the creation of a new party, along with the intention to run in the parliamentary elections. Mr. Saidov was charged with a range of politically motivated crimes and sentenced to 26 years in prison after a trial that was plagued with procedural irregularities. A shocking addendum to Mr. Saidov's case is the treatment of his lawyer, Mr. Kudratov, Shukrat Kudratov. The Tajikistan authorities arrested him in 2014. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Rights and Freedoms of Turkmenistan Citizens, which will be followed by Human Rights Movement Berduino, Kyrgyzstan. Rights and Freedoms of Turkmenistan Citizens, you have the floor.
I'm from Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is a country where there's no dialogue between the government and citizens. There's no civil society. The government is afraid of groups of citizens. Citizens are afraid to assemble because that can be subject to intimidation and harassment. And people are not in a position to defend the rights of their family members because they end up on blacklists. And when that's what happened when I tried to defend the rights of my husband who was in prison, there was pressure put on us to cease organizing assemblies, that we organized a meeting before the Turkmenistan embassy in Moscow. There is fear throughout the society. People don't trust their own neighbors, and throughout the country there are security agents who monitor and control what is happening in individual families. The conscription into the army is used also as a form of intimidation, and there are NGOs that are in a position to monitor the situation in prisons. International organizations do not have a good sense of what is happening. Our president makes empty declarations to the international community which are not followed up with any effect in the country.
And followed by Legal Resources Center from Moldova. Human Rights Movement Birduino, you have the floor.
Good morning. Thank you, moderator, for giving me the floor. Thank you for this session. What's happening in Kyrgyzstan in terms of peaceful assembly and association? I would like to provide you with an example. The public prosecutor of the Kyrgyz Republic, Madame Musmanova, who has been here for 2 days now, she's been speaking about the upcoming elections. And of course, we are very committed to this initiative. But as the French say, a will is not always enough to make it happen. The leader of a human rights organization and 2 independent journalists, following a trial and following 5 lawsuits, which ran counter to all of Kyrgyzstan's legislation, pay a hefty fine, 33 million sums, because they tried to use their right to freely express their dissent. The government of Kyrgyzstan's position was made clear not recently, and the Prime Minister of Kyrgyzstan declared that there would be a very good program for dealing with these issues. And when Kyrgyzstan joined the OSCE in 1992, there was a lot of success. And last year, the OSCE status was changed. We hope that Mr. Isak, who is committed to human rights, will ensure that the political and economic landscape, which cannot function properly without the contribution of its citizens on the basis of human dignity. Well, we hope that ODIHR will promote the Civil Solidarity Platform's recommendations. Recommendations are excellent, and you need to help the new government of Kyrgyzstan to return to those values. We also welcome the court decision which released from home arrest the human rights activist Sharikova, and we hope that the further implementation of recommendations will be carried out by the Kyrgyz authorities. In other words, we hope that they will show the world before the elections that they are committed to universal values. And of course, we would also very much like the status of the OSCE in Kyrgyzstan to be given a higher profile. Thank you.
Speaker is the Legal Resources Center from Moldova, followed by Civil Rights Defenders. Legal Resources Center from Moldova, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Moderator. 13 civil society organizations from Moldova expressed their deep concern regarding the worsening of their legal and operational environment. While an increasing number of civil society organizations in Moldova are taking a stand with regard to actions aimed at weakening our democratic institutions, such as the recently adopted amendments to the electoral system, we are witnessing with concern numerous actions aimed at dividing, discrediting, and discouraging us from being vocal and from participating in public affairs. Affiliated mass media conduct smear campaigns portraying the non-profits as shady bodies hijacked by political interests. Governmental agencies and ministries cause administrative harassment by refusing to provide access to public data or by excluding SCOs from ministerial working groups, while the political leaders convey an aggressive rhetoric labeling CSOs as foreign agents. In August 2017, the Ministry of Justice presented for public consultations draft provisions limiting foreign funding of non-commercial organizations. These provisions ban both foreign and public funding of CSOs involved in vaguely and broadly defined political activities. The draft also calls for additional reporting obligations for non-profits and provides harsh penalties for the failure to comply with the ban and reporting requirements. The proposal is a direct attack on CSOs that are active in promoting public policies because the absolute majority, at least 83% of the civil society sector from Moldova, is dependent on foreign funding. We urge the government of Moldova to reconsider this draft initiative and uphold its international obligations to promote freedom of association. We call on the representatives of public authorities, political parties and media institutions from Moldova to refrain from attacks on civil society organizations that are active, independent and have critical views on the initiatives of the authorities. Lastly, we call on the international community to disapprove all actions that undermine freedom of association in Moldova and to encourage the Moldovan authorities to effectively uphold the international standards on freedom of association and take effective actions in developing a robust civil society in our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Civil Rights Defenders, followed by the Center for the Development of Democracy and Human Rights. Civil Rights Defenders, you have the floor.
Thank you. Undemocratic states in the OSCE region today use a number of tactics to repress human rights defenders, but I would like to focus on one specific tactic that sometimes doesn't get enough attention, and that is isolation of human rights organizations by cutting their foreign funding. In Belarus, the government introduced the infamous law 193.1 already in 2005. The law criminalizes receiving foreign funding outside of government control, and human rights defenders risk 2 years in jail. At the same time, government use tax evasion laws to harass and imprison human rights defenders. In Russia, the foreign agent law and even more so the law on undesirable organizations are undermining the possibilities for NGOs to do their legitimate work. For example, last week, Alexander Verhovsky, leader of the Sova Center, was questioned in connection to 2 administrative cases under the so-called law on undesirable organizations. In Azerbaijan, receiving foreign funding outside of government control is banned since 2013. The Azeri legislation is clearly inspired by the Russian and Belarusian ones aimed at cutting off the funding of NGOs. In Kyrgyzstan, a Russian-inspired NGO law did not pass in 2016, but the mere fact that it was introduced in the parliament is worrisome. Finally, we have the law on foreign funding of NGOs in Hungary that was earlier described here by our Hungarian colleagues. We see a clear pattern of authoritarian states inspiring each other and learning repressive techniques from each other. We also see democratic states adapting to the rules of the game set up by the authoritarian states. They seem to forget sometimes that human rights defenders are not the real lawbreakers. It is authoritarian states that break international law by cutting off NGOs from their foreign funding. And the foreign funding is today the only type of substantial funding that enables them to conduct professional human rights work. We call on the states that restrict foreign funding to adhere to the commitments as members of the OSCE and repeal repressive laws. And we call on democratic states to support human rights defenders and put more pressure on authoritarian regimes to let the civil society work freely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Center for the Development of Democracy and Human Rights, followed by the Kazakh Community Association.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Yuri Jibladze, and I speak on behalf of the Center for the Development of Democracy and Human Rights. Civil society groups working in the post-Soviet region and facing pressure and persecution are thankful to many NGO colleagues around the world and governments of democratic countries for solidarity and support, including right here at this session. Speaking strongly against shrinking space, exposing cases of harassment, naming and shaming the culprits, making protection of civil society an important part of your foreign policy, adopting resolutions and statements at the international level, giving civil society space at intergovernmental organizations and providing political, moral, and financial and other support to NGOs and activists, giving them recognition in the form of awards, providing temporary shelter or asylum in the case of high risk, are all important ways of expressing solidarity and support. One of the best ways to support civil society groups is cooperating closely with them on the issues they address, using their data and reports and taking their recommendations seriously for developing policies and strategies to protect and develop human rights and democracy, making their voices and positions heard at the high level of governments and intergovernmental organizations. One example of such cooperation is the work of the International Human Rights Campaign called Prove They Are Alive, which I have the honor to represent. It has been working since 2013 to hold the practice of enforced disappearances in Turkmenistan. And involves members from human rights groups from Russia, the US, Norway, international NGOs, and Turkmen activists working at high risk. The campaign acts with the support of the OSCE-wide NGO coalition, the Civic Solidarity Platform, and actively interacts with many governments and intergovernmental organizations, including the OSCE, the UN, and the EU. We thank you for your continued support. However, now we need your support more than ever, because the situation with enforced disappearance in Turkmenistan has deteriorated even further since the last HDIM. We need to develop new strategies of the international community, and to discuss the new strategies and develop new approaches, we invite you to a side event tonight at 6 o'clock at room 2, where relatives of the victims of enforced disappearances will testify about their ordeal, and members of the Proof Their Life campaign will discuss with the audience, with the participants, these new approaches and new strategies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is the Kazakh Community Association, followed by the Center for Research and Protection of Fundamental Rights. Kazakh Community Association, you have the floor.
Здравствуйте. Балли Мажа.
Well, I'm from the Kazakh Community Association. On 29th July, a group of people, including myself, met in my country, in Kazakhstan, in a park, with a view to drafting a letter to be sent to international organizations, calling upon them to take into consideration the situation of human rights defenders who are being attacked in court on political grounds. We wanted to bring to an end the criminal investigations of Max Bakayev and Talgata Ayan. A dissident called Arona Kabiega, the former president of our movement, Diram Kuramshin, and also trade union leaders Kushak Bayeva and Imanila Lyusinova. I haven't been in Kazakhstan for 15 years. The authorities of Kazakhstan did not give me visas. They did not authorize me to go there. But since my mother passed away and there was a possibility to visit the country for 30 days without a visa, I went to participate in the march, which was very heavily attended by the forces of law and order. 30 activists who participated in the march were arrested. The people are afraid even to go out for a peaceful walk or to send a letter in the post office. Some Kazakh workers were beaten up by the police officers. People went out to protest, but they were detained and taken to police stations, even if they were just standing on the sidewalks. A number of people were arrested. The authorities of Kazakhstan must cease to persecute citizens for no good reason, simply because they are afraid of any criticism of the prevailing authorities in the country. Thank you for your attention.
Is the Center for Research and Protection of Fundamental Rights. You have the floor, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers and Poland for giving us the opportunity to speak here. In different times, poor policies have meant that women and children suffer from violence and other dangers. Governments and organizations that protect their rights should by no means forget about them. If a state doesn't want to protect its defenseless citizens, then this scourge encompass all people, women and children alike. We need to live by the law and not break or violate rights to freedom and to life. Women and children need to feel safe in order to develop and live fulfilling lives. And in Tajikistan, this is not allowed, really. After the September 2015 events, the government closed down the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, and the authorities of Tajikistan declared war on them and people who thought about democracy, and they were forced to flee the country. Their relatives have come under threat. They have been called to police stations and held there for a number of days, and innocent people have not been released. And and following the closure of this party, which was legally registered, the relatives of the members have suffered, and that is not right. They are imprisoned and threatened with physical violence. The people is intimidated, and everywhere there is a sense of fear. People fear if their relatives go to conferences and speak out about this as well. What relationship does this kind of state have if it behaves like this in the modern world with its citizens? Innocent people are sitting in prison. Please pay attention to what I am saying, and please consider it humanely and justly. Thank you.
It's already 1:01, and we have another 10 minutes of flexibility to continue with the right of reply. I thank you for your patience if you agree to stay here for another 10 minutes. But I will have to be very strict with timing. So I'm kindly asking all delegations willing to exercise their right to reply to stick strictly to 1 minute statement. The first speaker I have on my list is Spain. Spain, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I would like to thank the introducers for their presentations and to make a comment in reference to the presentation made by Madame Kostas. In relation with the law for the protection of citizens' safety, this is a law which was approved by the Spanish Parliament and the implementation of which is controlled judicially and which is submitted to all the criteria of the rule of law. The European Charter of Fundamental Rights and the Spanish Constitution foresee that any restriction on fundamental freedoms and rights must be enshrined in law, and they should respect the essence of those rights and freedoms in accordance with the principles of necessity and proportionality. It is Spain's commitment to ensure that this law is properly implemented and that the basic principles are respected. Madame Kostas referred to a certain number of practices called estraches, which are a form of public denunciation demonstrations, and she also referred to other cases of intimidation and harassment, which are indeed condemnable. So the Spanish government intends to take the necessary measures so that the freedom of assembly and association can be exercised in full respect of fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals. Spain is fully committed to the OSCE's agreements and principles, and we intend to undertake everything in our means in order to ensure its implementation. Thank you.
Followed by Belarus. Hungary, you have the floor.
Thank you. On the 13th of June, the Hungarian Parliament adopted an act of transparency and of organizations receiving support from foreign entities. The main objective of the new legislation is to ensure full transparency of civil organizations, and it does not constitute an obstacle to the work of NGOs. The act is not targeting a specific group of NGOs, but is applicable of all 60,000 civil organizations operating in Hungary. Restrictions are not among its goals, neither of its tools. In order to bring the Act in line with international commitments, we conducted constructive dialogue on various fora, among others the Venice Commission, the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, the Commission of the EU, and ODA. The Venice Commission, in its opinion, recognized that the law addresses a current problem and that transparency pursued by the legislator is a legitimate goal. It welcomed, among others, the strong involvement of the judiciary in the process and the fact that there will be no separately established registry for this purpose. We also out consultations with the experts of ODIHR in Budapest, with main stakeholders from the government, the National Assembly, and civil society. Finally, let me stress again that the uninterrupted operation of all civil organizations is guaranteed by the fundamental law of Hungary and by several other legal instruments. We believe that the newly adopted Act is proportional, non-discriminatory, and is in compliance with all international obligations, and does indeed represent valuable examples from other countries' legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Belarus, followed by Kazakhstan. Belarus, you have the floor.
Thank you. We would like to thank the delegation of the United States for mentioning the fact of
registration of the civic movement Tell the Truth this year. At present, Belarus considers measures on simplification of registration procedures of public associations. In particular, by now a set of documents can be submitted via email while applying for registration. Restrictions on holding of mass events are accepted only in cases provided by law in public order interests to preserve morality, rights and freedoms of other persons, as it was this spring. In the majority of cases, implications on holding of mass events are being approved. For example, last year, implications to hold more than 9,000 events on the territory of our capital, Minsk, submitted to the administration of the city, were submitted, and 99% of these applications were approved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Kazakhstan, followed by Greece. Kazakhstan, you have the floor.
I represent the Office of the Ombudsman of Kazakhstan, and as a sub-national institution that protects human rights, we of course monitor the situation in the country, and we submit reports and recommendations to decision makers in the authorities. The declaration was made about the need to review and improve the standard-setting legislation in this respect, and the Ombudsman for Protection of Human Rights takes advantage of international experience in this regard. Now, a number of speakers today talked about democratic reforms underway in the country, and this year the status of the Ombudsman has been enshrined in the Constitution, which gives the Ombudsman a stronger base, a stronger legislative base for his actions. And the Ministry on Religious Affairs and Civil Society is very open to dialogue with the civil society, and I'd also like to mention the fact that there is an advisory council, a council of experts advising the Ombudsman. It includes representatives of civil society with a view to discussing topical and current issues and making recommendations, including recommendations of a legislative nature. Thank you for your attention.
By the United States. Greece, you have the floor.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to inform you briefly on how things stand in my country concerning the issue of freedom of peaceful assembly and association and the role of the civil society in the protection of human rights. Freedom of association is unequivocally, firmly and broadly protected by the Greek constitution. Several Muslim minority associations and NGOs freely operate there under the Greek law. These thriving NGOs have been registered by the competent courts and operate unimpeded, thus promoting cultural, educational and economic life of this part of the country. There are indeed 3 cases that have been brought before the European Court of Human Rights back in 2007 and 2008 by 3 minority associations, and the Greek courts in practice take into consideration the court standards set by the rulings of these of 2007 and 2008, to the effect that since then other minority associations have submitted applications and have been established and duly recognized. It is not accurate that associations are not registered on the grounds of including the word Turkish in their title. Recently, the association was registered including the denomination Turkish in the title, but different that it was used to denote mother tongue of its members. On its part, the Greek government is constantly considering appropriate ways and means to implement the 2007 and 2008 judgments, including potential legislative adjustments in order to make possible the opening of relevant domestic procedures.
Thank you very much. I have to ask you to conclude. The next speaker is the United States, followed by France. United States, you have the floor.
Mr. Moderator, the United States recognizes the important role the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination plays in highlighting the global human rights concerns, and we are reviewing the committee's decision. The United States has high regard for the rights of freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. We respect diverse viewpoints, but we reject the egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence that took place in Charlottesville, as the President and other members of his cabinet have stated publicly. In accordance with the commitments agreed in the Copenhagen Agreement, our justice system provides effective remedies where violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms are alleged to have occurred. As we made clear yesterday, the fullest force of the law will be brought against those responsible for the violence in Charlottesville, Virginia, including the killing of Heather Heyer.
Thank you very much, and I have to announce that the interpreters will be leaving us, but we are continuing with a few rights of reply, which we have left. The next speaker is France, followed by Azerbaijan. France, you have the floor.
Thank you. However, my statement is in French. La France salue les discussions productives de cette session dédiée à la liberté de réunion pacifique et d'association, y compris la présentation de la représentante du panel d'experts du BIDDH, et souhaite apporter quelques éléments de précision sur le respect par la France de la liberté de manifestation dans le cadre de l'état d'urgence. S'agissant de la liberté de manifestation, la loi sur l'état d'urgence ne contient aucune disposition spécifique. Ainsi, la mise en œuvre de l'état d'urgence, qui prendra fin en France au 1er novembre, n'a aucune conséquence sur le régime juridique de droit commun relatif aux manifestations publiques qui continue à s'appliquer. De manière générale, en France, toutes manifestations sur la voie publique sont soumises à une obligation déclarative. Il ne s'agit pas d'un régime d'autorisation préalable, mais uniquement de déclaration préalable. Cependant, la tenue de la manifestation doit être compatible avec le maintien de l'ordre public. Et si l'autorité de police n'a pas d'autre moyen efficace que d'interdire la manifestation, l'interdiction peut être prononcée. Ainsi, la liberté de manifestation, à laquelle la France est particulièrement attachée, demeure bien évidemment la règle, même en période d'état d'urgence. Des manifestations très rapidement. En cette matière, le juge administratif exerce un contrôle particulièrement approfondi. Et permettez-moi enfin de rappeler tout notre soutien aux activités du BIDDH et de son panel consultatif. La France était soumise en 2014 à un exercice volontaire d'observation de ces manifestations et nous encourageons d'autres États participants à faire de même.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Azerbaijan, followed by Armenia. Azerbaijan, you have the floor.
Thank you. I would like to exercise the right of reply regarding the statement made by the USA and some NGOs here. There are provided all opportunities for peaceful assembly association in Azerbaijan. This year, in April, and last year, opposition held several rallies with the consent of executive power of Baku. During the rallies, there were not any obstacles or restrictions. On the contrary, official Baku declared that they highly appreciate to be held sanctioned rallies by Azerbaijan opposition. State's point of view is that opposition has to hold rallies according to the law. According to the law, rallies will be held in the very places which relevant executive power of Baku will determine. The opposition is able to organize anytime the rallies freely determined places, approximately like in all European countries. Short, I would like to stress on amendments on NGO legislation done in 2014. NGO legislation serves to enhance transparent activity of NGOs, social control, accountability, increasing of responsibility and efficiency. Low demand from NGOs to be open and transparent. Some political activities is not involved for their political view as claimed here. Are charged on criminal codes, articles, swindle, etc. All these crimes are considered serious crime according to the legislation of Azerbaijan, like in USA and other Western European countries. There are many such examples in your countries as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Armenia, followed by the Russian Federation. Now you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to respond to the points made by 3 NGOs who spoke on the freedom of association and civil society in Armenia. First, I would like to respond to Helsinki Vanadzor committee. I don't want to go into debates who should thank whom here. I'm certainly ready to thank you. Unfortunately, she left. And thank you for being here. And you may be thankful for those who made your appearance here possible. I agree with you that OSCE commitments should be reference point for our dialogue. And there is no OSCE commitment on protecting armed rebellion. This was not my definition. This is a definition pronounced here by Mr. Ioannisyan yesterday, and I borrowed his word to show degree the violent seizure of police station differs from freedom of expression. One can hardly find any OSCE participating states who will consider armed people perpetrating killings of number of policemen and other persons assisting them as a peaceful protest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Russian Federation, followed by Ukraine. Russian Federation, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a temptation to follow the good example of our French colleague and to make my statement in Russian language, but unfortunately I'm not sure that everybody understands Russian well enough, so I will make it in English. We would like to express our right to reply with regard to the statement that has been made by our Ukrainian colleague, and to remind again that the Republic of Crimea became a part of the Russian Federation, an integral part, I would like to emphasize, as a result of the referendum, which was held in that region in full compliance with the international. As for the statements made today by some introducers sitting at the same table in front of us, who speculated on the issue of so-called authoritarian regime in my country, I would like to express our strong disappointment with regard to those statements, which, in our opinion, might undermine and question credibility and impartiality of the introducers and of those who invite them to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ukraine, followed by the United Kingdom. Ukraine, you have.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. In response to the statement by Union of Journalists of the Russian Federation, as well as remarks of the distinguished Russian colleague, we would like to reject any attempts to present the Crimea as belonging to Russia, because these statements and attempts are clearly in advocating for violation of international law. We would like to recall that territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders was reaffirmed by the UN General Assembly Resolution Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, and that the 2016 UN General Assembly Resolution Situation of Human Rights in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol clearly stipulates the fact of occupation of Crimea by Russia. And also in response to the NGO CIS Observer, we would like to inform the participants that the draft law on the Constitutional Court of Ukraine was elaborated in cooperation with many international institutions and received positive assessment of the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is United Kingdom, followed by United Kingdom. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. One very small point in my national capacity. Mr. Moderator, the opening speaker, Ms. Trasakis, made a rather broad assertion that the UK had a national database of suspected extremists, if I've written that down correctly. Not clear to me what she was referring, but it struck me as slightly misleading. I would be happy to offer a factual response if she would be able to provide my delegation with clarification of what she's referring to later to back up the assertion. We could do that after. We can do that after the.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Canada, followed by Estonia. Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. And just in following up the last intervention by the Russian Federation, I would like to repeat Canada's known position that we have not and will not recognize the annexation, the illegal annexation of Crimea from Ukraine by the Russian Federation. And we do continue to call on the Russian Federation to return Crimea to Ukraine, and so that Ukraine can have its entire territorial integrity respected and its sovereignty respected as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the floor goes to Estonia as the last speaker. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to respond to the Russian delegation and point out again the position of the EU, that we reiterate our strong condemnation of the illegal annexation of Crimea Sevastopol to the Russian Federation, and we will not recognize it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was the final right of reply intervention. I apologize for having gone beyond schedule. The list of right of reply requests also was growing as we were going along, but thank you for your patience. Thank you to all of you for your interventions. Thank you to our introducer for the great contributions they made that kick-started the discussion. Thank you to the interpreters and also for their flexibility in continuing to work beyond schedule, and to my ODR colleagues who assisted in the process of moderating this session. Thank you.